The committee will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare recess of the committee at any time. As a reminder to all members, we have a hard stop at 1:30 p.m. Members who are unable to ask their questions at today's hearing will be given priority at our next hearing with the Secretary. Pursuant to House rules, the committee will continue to provide accommodations for members who request to participate in hearings virtually. But I'm very happy to have the vast majority of our members and our witness participating in person here today. As a reminder, those who are not fully vaccinated must continue to wear a mask in the hearing room and practice social distancing. But I would also like to encourage our members to continue wearing masks if they feel more comfortable doing so. And so, members, we have a little bit of a problem with our timing apparatus here this morning. We can see the timing here when your 5 minutes are up. Our witness can see her 5 minutes, and of course, it will be monitored by our friends on the opposite side of the aisle, so we will make sure that we are all in sync with the timing. Let me just say that I'm going to be very strict with the timing. If you take all of your 5 minutes to ask the question and then expect the secretary to answer for another 2 or 3 minutes, that won't happen today. After 5 minutes, you will be gavelled. So thank you. This hearing is entitled, Building Back a Better, More Equitable Housing Infrastructure for America, Oversight of the Department of Housing and Urban Development. I now recognize myself for 4 minutes to give an opening statement. First of all, a happy good morning, Secretary Fudge. I'm so delighted to have you with us today to discuss the work that the Biden administration is doing to build a more fair, equitable, and accessible housing infrastructure in this country. I want to begin by applauding you and the Biden administration for treating our housing crisis with the urgency and seriousness it deserves. The Trump administration made it crystal clear that it didn't appreciate the magnitude of our nation's housing crisis by repeatedly proposing deep budget cuts to HUD programs and taking action to undermine our fair housing laws. The Trump administration showed a complete disregard for low and moderate income families, people of color, the LGBTQ plus community, and immigrants. It's only because of Democrats in Congress that HUD's budget was not decimated during Trump's presidency. Because elections matter, President Biden and HUD have now begun to reverse Trump's anti-fair housing rules. Democrats on this committee also remain laser-focused on ensuring that eligible families receive the housing assistance available to them through the CARES Act, the December Relief Package, the American Rescue Plan, and other coronavirus relief legislation. And so we must remember, however, that we're not just building back our economy from the pandemic and Donald Trump's disastrous housing policies. We're building back better, and that's my focus for today's hearing. Key to building back better and more equitably is understanding that housing is infrastructure. For the first time in a generation, we have a real opportunity to fix structural problems in our housing system and reverse decades of disinvestment in low-income communities and communities of color. So last week, I and several members of this committee introduced a legislative package of 3 bills to do just that. One is, first, the Housing is Infrastructure Act. Second is the Indian Homelessness Act. And the third is the Down Payment Toward Equity Act that would help access to address the racial gap and home ownership gaps by providing $100 billion toward down payment and other financial assistance for first-generation home buyers. We must make housing a top priority. These generational investments will increase home ownership, provide a permanent housing safety structure, and end homelessness in this country once and for all. So, Secretary Fudge, I know you're the right person to take advantage of this moment. Thank you so much for your leadership on this absolutely critical issue. I look forward to your testimony today. I now recognize the ranking member of the committee, the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. McHenry, for 4 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thanks for holding today's hearing. Secretary Fudge, welcome. Nice to see you in your first appearance before Congress on that side of the table. It has a different perspective. But I must begin today by asking, where is Treasury Secretary Yellen? I sent the chair a letter last week asking the Treasury Secretary join us for today's hearing, but it looks like they couldn't make that happen. Maybe Secretary Fudge can shed some light on the most pressing issue in housing at the moment for the federal government, and that is in regards to the rental assistance program. I know millions of renters across the country and across the income spectrum would like some answers. Look, Madam Chair, we're on a deadline. The Biden administration's eviction moratorium ends on July 31st. The CDC has already said no more extensions. So what are people supposed to do? What is the plan? Last December, Congress provided $25 billion in emergency rental assistance. Democrats then added another $21 billion this year for the exact same purpose. That is $46 billion. This might not sound like a lot of money, considering what the Democrats are talking about and spending $3.5 trillion on the progressive agenda with the next budget. But I assure you, if the Americans who have to decide next month whether they want food for their family or to pay back rent, it certainly is. This money was specifically intended to retire old rent debts and end the threat of eviction for millions who fell behind during the pandemic. So where is that money and who is it helping? The silence is deafening. The Washington Post reported over the weekend that little more than $1 billion has made it out the door. And I'll remind my colleagues again, we've allocated $46 billion to help with this rental problem. Republicans on this committee have put forward a solution, the Renter Protection Act. This bill would end the Biden administration's mismanagement of the emergency rental assistance and get the money out the door now. Last week, I called for the committee to consider this bill, but the chair hasn't scheduled it or anything like it for a markup. Okay, so what about this hearing? What about a hearing? We are days away from a preventable problem, and instead of figuring out how to keep families in their homes, we're going to get an update from HUD on all the other stuff on a forward-looking basis they're working on. This is government at its worst. It's clear Democrats would rather talk about anything but the rental assistance program and resolving old rental debts. Not to mention, with this level of mismanagement and lack of transparency, I can only imagine the amount of waste, fraud, and abuse of taxpayer dollars we'll have to address. But lucky for us, we have no information. So hear no evil, see no evil, I guess, is the approach right now. Fortunately for this hearing, HUD has a statutory obligation with respect to transparency of these funds. The original emergency rental assistance law requires that the Treasury Department, quote, in consultation with the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, who we have before us today, is to provide public reports on the use of the emergency rental assistance program. So while I would prefer to ask these questions to Secretary Yellen because they are supposed to be in the driver's seat of Treasury, Madam Secretary, I'll direct them to you. And my questions here regard the mismanagement of this program and why less than 4% has gone to help renters. 96% has been unallocated. So where is the Treasury Secretary? I'll ask that again. And I look forward to the questions.
I now recognize the gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Cleaver, for 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And let me begin where you began this committee early on, and that was with your almost holy housing obsession, particularly on affordable housing. So thank you very much. The country, I think, is moving in that direction. I'd also like to thank my dear friend, Secretary Fudge, for not only being with us today, but for taking the time this past May to visit Kansas City to discuss the vital role that HUD has in every one of our congressional districts. Secretary Fudge is, in fact, listening. She is taking bold action, and in her commitment to improving the department and the quality of life for hard-working Americans is unquestionable. Madam Chair, we know that we do not need another study. I hope that there's no legislation designed to study housing. We do not need another news article to tell us that the wealthiest nation on earth have streets filled with homeless folk. We do not need another report to explain the American dream of homeownership. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I now recognize the gentleman from Arkansas, Mr. Hill, for 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate our friend and former colleague, Secretary Fudge, appearing before us today. But I have to reinforce the comments made by the ranking member about the noticeable lack of Secretary Yellen. I can't help but mention how available Secretary Mnuchin made himself over the 4 years in office, and particularly for this committee during the pandemic. And I hope we can expect that from the Biden administration. It's imperative to have Secretary Yellen here to ensure accountability for the trillions of dollars the government has spent over the last year. Alarmingly, only 11% of the $9 billion provided to HUD by the CARES Act has been spent to date, and none of the American Rescue Plan money has been used to help an actual household yet. Even more concerning is the gross mismanagement of the eviction rental assistance program. In my home state of Arkansas, of the $200 million allocated by Congress in December, a mere $1.4 million, 70 basis points, has been distributed. I look forward to discussing this more during my questions, and I yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. I want to welcome today's distinguished witness and former colleague of ours, the Honorable Marcia Fudge, who is the Secretary of the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. This is Secretary Fudge's first time appearing before this committee in her current capacity, and we welcome her testimony today. Without objection, your written statement will be made part of the record. You will have 5 minutes to summarize your testimony. You should be able to see a timer on the table in front of you that will indicate how much time you have left. I would ask you to be mindful of the timer, and when the red light appears so quickly, wrap up your testimony so that we can be respectful of the committee members' time. Secretary Fudge, you are now recognized for 5 minutes to present your oral testimony.
Thank you so very much. Good morning. Chairwoman Waters, Ranking Member McHenry, and distinguished members of this committee, many of my friends, and I miss you. It's good to see you. Thank you for this opportunity to discuss the transformational investments the Biden-Harris administration has proposed to advancing housing opportunity in America. I know President Biden is committed in his head and in his heart to help more people find a stable, affordable, and dignified place to call home. He has made that commitment clear. The President's proposed budget for fiscal year 2022 requests $68.7 billion for HUD. This represents an increase of $9 billion, or 15%, from our enacted funding from the previous fiscal year. The American people need every dollar in this budget. Today, it is harder to find an affordable home in America than at any point since the 2008 financial crisis. The high cost of housing keeps millions of families up every night. They wonder if they can afford to keep a roof over their head and still manage to keep their lights on, to pay for their prescriptions, or to put foods on their tables. The President's budget takes bold action to address our affordable housing crisis and to dramatically strengthen our social safety net for the most vulnerable among us. The President's budget requests $3.5 billion to provide housing and supportive services to Americans experiencing homelessness, including young people and survivors of domestic violence. It contains $30.4 billion for HUD's Housing Choice Voucher Program. If enacted, it would deliver life-changing assistance to an additional 200,000 households. The President understands that investing in housing represents a major solution for advancing equity on behalf of underserved Americans. The President's budget requests $723 million in Indian housing block grants, to create affordable housing and spark economic development on tribal lands. It contains $3.8 billion in community development block grants, including $295 million in targeted funding for historically underserved areas in cities, small towns, and rural communities. Nearly half of our public housing stock is more than 50 years old. Many properties face significant capital needs. This is not just a safety issue, but an issue of racial justice, as Americans of color represent roughly 70% of people living in public housing. The President's budget provides $3.2 billion in capital funds to help restore public housing and to improve the quality of life for the residents we serve. We know people of color are especially vulnerable to the threats posed by climate change and extreme weather. We are 3 times as likely to live in areas which lack green infrastructure that helps guard against flooding. Too often, we find ourselves in the path of natural disasters and are denied the resources we need to rebuild our homes and our communities. That is why President Biden provides $800 million to strengthen climate resilience in public housing on tribal lands and across HUD-supported communities. The President's 2022 budget is just one part of his commitment to make generational investments into America's housing. In addition to the vital support contained in his budget, the President has called for sweeping new housing investments through his Build Back America agenda. These investments would help build or restore more than 2 million affordable homes. The Build Back Better agenda would help more families of modest means realize the dream of homeownership. It would expand our supply of affordable rental housing and help revitalize our public housing stock. Our nation must move with urgency to enact investments contained in both the President's budget and his Build Back Better agenda. During the COVID-19 crisis, we all came to appreciate just how important it is to have a safe and stable place to call home. Today, thanks to the leadership of President Biden, our country is making great strides in rebuilding from the pandemic. Our economy is surging, more Americans continue to get vaccinated, life is beginning to feel closer to normal. Yet, America cannot return to the status quo of yesterday, prior to the pandemic. We must not return to an America beset by crumbling homes and buildings, to an America grappling with a crisis in affordable housing. We must build back better together. I look forward to partnering with this committee to help make housing for all a reality in our nation, and to ensure that HUD acts as a responsible steward for the funding entrusted to us. And with that, Madam Chair, I am happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes for questions. Since I joined this committee 3 decades ago, I've been consistently focused on homelessness, not just managing it, but ending this national embarrassment for one of the richest nations in the world. As you know, homelessness is also a racial justice issue. Despite representing less than 30% of the total population, Black, Indigenous, and Latinx individuals make up well over 2/3 of the people experiencing homelessness in America. Once again, they fall into homelessness. They are also far less likely than their white counterparts to be able to access the health and mental health services they need to obtain and maintain housing. Just last week, a team at the Urban Institute, led by Mary Cunningham, who previously testified before this committee on my Ending Homelessness Act, conducted a study on the effectiveness of permanent supportive housing in interrupting the costly cycle of chronic homelessness. In a randomized trial, participants in a Denver supportive housing initiative reduced their arrest and emergency room visits by 40% relative to the comparison group and more effectively addressed their health needs, including such as with doctor's office visits and prescriptions. So, Secretary Fudge, you and I have talked about this endlessly, all during the time that we've served here. And I know how you feel about homelessness. And I know that we had a conversation more than once about supportive services. And of course, we know that with supportive services, we're able to get people like more independent. If we can help them get to the doctor, if we can help them make sure they take their prescriptions and all of that. And so I think it is important for us to talk about supportive services, kind of what that means as we deal with this homelessness issue. Because as we talk about, you know, additional affordable units, and rental assistance and all that, we know that to the degree that we're able to assist people take hold of their daily lives with not only taking care of doctor's appointments and all of that, but being able to get up every day and maybe do everything from exercise to read, to go to the local library, what have you, that this would go a long way in helping them to become independent. So how do you feel about supportive services and what that could mean in terms of the way that we look at homelessness?
Thank you very much for the question. I mean, if we don't do supportive services, Madam Chair, what we do is really set up people to fail. Once we get people off the streets, and you know as well as I do that on any night in America, more than 580,000 people in this country, the greatest nation in the world, have no place to sleep. And so until we can start to provide those services, whether it be health services, whether it be educational services, access to work, access to transportation, and a myriad of other things, we really have not done much because we have not given them the tools and the ability to live on their own successfully.
I know we absolutely agree on that issue. Let me just say a word about this rental assistance that the ranking member talked about. We passed the HEROES Act in June and again in October. We also passed the standalone version of the Emergency Rental Assistance Bill in July. It wasn't until December that Republicans came to the table to help us pass emergency rental assistance. So it's very interesting that Republicans are now complaining about delays in implementation. We would have been much further along in the implementation if Republicans had not dragged their feet in acknowledging the problem from the start. And they can't be more worried about it than I am. That's my issue. That's the issue that I put the most time on. And yes, I added additional money after we had done the CARES money into the American Relief Plan. So we know that we have a problem all over this country. I know that Secretary Yellen and you, everybody's concerned about that. We're doing everything we can to get the states to do what they should do in putting together the programs that they need to do to get the rental assistance out. So I just wanted to say that as I end and turn the time over to Mr. McHenry. The gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. McHenry, who is the ranking member of the committee, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And thank you for talking about the same thing that I think we all care about. We've allocated $46 billion we had to rental assistance. The Emergency Rental Assistance Program was supported by both parties when the law finally got passed. And when Secretary Yellen was here in March, she pledged that she would come back and before this committee to explain what was going on. And so, according to the documents from Treasury, less than 4% of the money provided by Congress has reached eligible households. So, Secretary Fudge, can you tell us how much of the $46 billion in rental assistance has ended up in the hands of renters or their landlords at this point?
Well, certainly I cannot speak for Secretary Yellen, but I will give you the facts as I know them. I'd be happy to do it. What I do know is that Treasury has obligated 100% of the resources from emergency rental. It is in the hands of states, local communities, and some continuums of care. So the resources are out. It is not a matter of the fact that Treasury didn't get it out. 100% of the resources are out. What we are doing now to assist—
How many are in the hands of renters?
Sir, I have no idea, but I would say this to you.
So is the Washington Post story correct that it's
I've
just
not
over
read
$1
it.
billion? Were you familiar with the Washington Post story I referenced from the weekend?
But I've not read the story, sir, so I don't know if it's accurate or not.
Okay, so you're saying the funds are allocated, but you're not sure if it's been gotten in the hands of anyone.
Well, I know it has gotten in the hands of some people. I don't know that number.
Is that knowable from government, or is it, I'm not trying to play a pop quiz on you and testifying, but you are under law statutorily consulted by the Treasury Secretary for this program. And since she is not appearing, and this is a very pressing issue, I think we have a right to know why only 4% is actually gotten in the hands of eligible households. Is that a correct number?
As I said, sir, I don't know if it is or not.
So we
What I
don't
do
know,
but
we
I-
don't know if it's $1 billion, less, more, of the $46 billion.
HUD does not track the resources, sir.
Well, statutorily, we will follow up with you on
consult.
that comment, because statutorily, you are required to publish the data about ERA.
In consultation with Treasury.
Yes, but HUD is the one to publish the report
In
statutorily
consultation
under ERA. So Section 501G of Division N of Public Law 116-260, which created the original ERA program, are you familiar with it? It reads, reporting requirements, the Treasury Secretary, in consultation with the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, shall provide public reports not less frequently than quarterly regarding the use of funds made available under this act. So the last report says only 4% has gotten in the hands of renters. And do you dispute that?
I don't know if it's accurate or not, so no, I do not dispute it.
Are you familiar with the report that your department published?
Yes.
And in that report, it says less than 4% has gotten in the hands of renters.
The numbers change every day, sir.
Okay, but you have no idea if they're, what those numbers are at this moment.
I do not.
Okay, so given the statutory obligation, can you tell us what action HUD is taking to make sure that we get help in the hands of these renters faster? What are you doing to make that faster with Secretary Yellen?
We are the people that are providing the technical assistance. And I would say to you,
What technical assistance are you providing to get it out of the door faster? Is this an urgent issue for your department?
it is.
What are you doing to make it faster?
We are talking to the communities that are the people that have the least capacity to use the resources. So we are helping small and rural communities. We are helping small and rural communities to get the resources from their states and from their county and other local governments through the housing trust funds, et cetera, because most of them do not have the capacity. We give them money, but we don't give them people. We don't give them
You
enough
spent
capacity to
$800
handle
million
it.
on overhead for this program to distribute just over $1 billion.
But they don't go to the rural communities, sir.
But understand, what has been spent by this administration is almost the same amount in overhead as actually gotten in the hands of renters. That is how deeply flawed this program is. Now, this is something that requires, I think, your attention and Secretary Yellen's attention. This is an absolute, it looks like complete mismanagement at this point, when you only have less than 4% of the money getting in the hands of renters for this very important program.
Let me just, if I may, sir, let me just first off, we did make a mistake. Treasury actually publishes the report, not HUD. We consult with them. That's number one.
The gentleman's time has expired, and this program is overseen by Ms. Yellen, the Treasury. When she's before us, then these questions will be
And that's why I
appropriately
raised the
answered.
question to
The
invite the
gentleman from
Secretary of
California,
Treasury
Mr.
here.
Sherman, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Secretary Fudge. Honored to have you here, thrilled to say the word Secretary Fudge. And I can think of, it's so appropriate that you are our sole witness here for this hearing, and I can think of no better use of the committee's time than to hear directly and solely from you in this hearing. The first question is something I'd just like you to respond for the record. Our colleague, Salud Carbajal, has a bill, the Naomi Schwartz Safe Parking Program Act, and I want to thank the chairwoman for noticing that bill for this hearing. And it focuses on those who are sleeping in their cars, the vehicular homeless. And I hope that you'd respond for the record as to whether we can do more to help people who are sleeping in their cars. Happens especially in Southern California. And particularly you and your staff could take a look at the Naomi Schwartz Safe Parking Program Act. I'd now like to focus on Section 8, which is so important to Southern California. People get the Section 8 voucher, but then they can't find a landlord in my district who will accept it. Senators Coons and Kramer have a bill, the Choice and Affordable Housing Act. But I hear the story all the time. People end up moving 50, 30 miles away from my district because they can't find a landlord. And I don't represent that wealthy a district. So do you think that we can and should do more to incentivize landlord participation in the Section 8 program?
Absolutely. And let me just say, if I may, Mr. Sherman, that the $46 billion is needed. There's never been anyone who can say people who are homeless or at risk of experiencing homelessness don't need the money. If there's a problem on the federal side, that is not their problem. The resources are needed every day to get people on the street. In California, most people can't afford to live in California anymore. And so the homelessness problem is so great there because even if we can find a landlord who is willing to rent to someone who is getting a Section 8 voucher, they can get so much more money from someone else. And so there is such a small supply for such a great demand.
Thank you. Members of the committee know that I've been concerned with these PACE loans because you have a first mortgage on your home, and then the PACE loan comes in as, in effect, a firster or ahead of the first mortgage. And that can pose a threat to federal programs like FHA that guarantee first mortgages. But I'm also concerned because, as the National Consumer Law Center says, these products are frequently expensive loans that are often pushed by aggressive contractors for projects which provide questionable savings and pose serious risks of predatory lending. That's why I want to thank the Chairwoman for noticing for this hearing my bill, the Improving Federal Oversight of PACE Financing Act, and to thank the National Consumer Law Center for endorsing that bill. Madam Secretary, would you agree that we need to take more steps to protect consumers and the federal mortgage guarantee and assistance programs when it comes to these predatory PACE loans?
Well, I don't know that I would agree to it being predatory, but I would say that I do believe.
Some are actually, some of them are predatory, and some are not predatory. I want to make that clear. There are some that are quite legitimate, but they come in above the
No, I absolutely agree. We need to have more conversations, further discussions, and look at it to be sure that it truly is providing a source of affordable financing. Yes, I agree.
Thank you. I'll yield back.
Thank you. The gentlewoman from Missouri, Mrs. Wagner, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
I thank you, Madam Chairwoman, and welcome our former colleague, now Madam Secretary Fudge. First, and I think you're going to hear this from all of us because we are just deeply, deeply disappointed and frustrated that Treasury Secretary Yellen is not testifying today. And I know you're going to take a number of questions from us based on the joint efforts between HUD and Treasury. The Treasury Department has failed to properly administer more than $46 billion with a B in rental assistance to struggling families. And frankly, Madam Secretary, the taxpayers in Missouri's 2nd Congressional District deserve more accountability and transparency than what we are seeing from the Biden administration. Congress has appropriated this money for families facing the threat of eviction, but less than 4%, as we're going to hear over and over again, of the rental assistance funds have actually reached eligible households. It is unacceptable that Secretary Yellen is not appearing before this committee when time is so urgent. We've got 2 weeks before expiration. She should be here today to answer for the mismanagement of the Emergency Rental Assistance Program. $46 billion and less than 4% reaching those who need it. Secretary Fudge, outside of Treasury's emergency rental assistance programs, HUD received tens of billions in community development block grants and homeless assistance grants from the CARES Act, 2 different programs almost a year and a half ago, and frankly, the vast majority of which remains unspent. Only 12.3% of the $5 billion in the CARES CDBG funds have yet been spent by grantees, while only 9.4% of homeless assistance grants in the CARES Act have been spent. What is this money that's in your jurisdiction, Madam Secretary? Why are these funds delayed from reaching those who need it the most?
Thank you for that question. I think it's a great question. HUD has actually obligated, which means we have given to grantees more than 93% of all CARES money. Part of the problem with the CARES money is that as communities receive the CARES money and then they receive the COVID money, the rescue money, what they determined was the CARES money is the money that needed more planning, that gave them a longer period of time to spend. And so what they basically said was, let's spend the emergency money right away. CARES money, we want to take the time to actually plan so that no one will accuse them of waste, fraud, and abuse, which we do often when people harshly and hastily spend federal resources. So they are in the planning phase. They have almost 4 years left on CARES dollars. So those are the dollars they're using last, but they do have it.
But the need is so great right now, Madam Secretary. And so let me get to my second question here, which is, I think, a reflection of what we've seen with this patchwork quilt of different rental assistance programs. There's been a lot said about the ability and inability of certain jurisdictions to build 2, 3, 4 different emergency rental assistance programs and keep track of all the money with so many competing rules and timelines. And much of this, I think, has to do with the rules that have been set out that are so onerous and that are not being properly administered by our federal agencies and oversought by our federal agencies at both HUD and Treasury. So there's competing rules and timelines. Given the limited experience and expertise of certain localities, wouldn't it be easier to run if there was only one consolidated program with one rule set?
Well, I don't know that it would be easier. It depends on what the rules would be. But I would certainly suggest to you that most communities are accustomed to dealing with HUD. They get most of their technical assistance, even though Congress decided to send the money through Treasury. Communities are accustomed to dealing with HUD.
But we've sent a lot through HUD
together,
too, Madam Secretary.
I'm sorry?
We've sent a lot through HUD also, but
And
much of it.
our resources are out, Ms. Wagner.
Well, but they're not being spent at the local level. Those rules, that rule set, that oversight, that accountability comes back up through your agency. So I'm not sure if my time is expiring. I haven't been watching. How much time? I do. Well, I would just say anything we can do to try and streamline this progress, to get the money to both the renters and the landlords that are suffering right now is what needs to be done. Not 4 years from now, right now. So I will yield back. I'm sure I've used the...
And I would agree with you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to deal just for a second with this question about Yellen as opposed to Secretary Fudge and HUD. No, I did not invite her to intrude on the first time that this secretary would appear before us. And I don't intend to treat women that way. And so, no, Yellen is not here. She'll be here when the quarterly time is due, and that is it.
And the minority looks very forward to that, Madam Chairman. Thank you.
The gentleman from New York, Mr. Meeks, who is the chair of the House Committee on Foreign Affairs, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Madam Secretary, I'm delighted to see you, and even more delighted with the job that you're already doing at HUD. You know, you have made increasing production and access to affordable housing a priority for HUD's budget, and you've identified our severe shortage of affordable housing as a barrier to the home purchasing process. And as you know, since the financial crisis, private investors have focused much on real estate because of high yields. However, what I'm concerned about is that the private investors can often outcompete potential first-time home buyers. Some cite cumbersome FHA paperwork as slowing down the process for traditional home buyers, as well as making the rehab loan process expensive. So my question is, can you consider or look at streamlining the FHA loan process to put first-time home buyers in a better position to compete with private firms in the home purchasing process?
Absolutely, and we're doing that now by looking at a number of things. One is, you know, HUD historically has not given a lot of small dollar loans. That's what people need to rehabilitate their homes. We are changing that. HUD has looked at credit in a way that we think has been unfair to persons of color or low-income or moderate home buyers, because we have weighted student debt differently than we have other debt. And so we have created an environment in which people primarily who carry student debt, Black people, brown people, poor people, and moderate income people. So we have decided to weight that differently to allow people to really be creditworthy at this stage. We've also, in conjunction with our chair, looked at down payment assistance. So we are doing a lot of the things that you're requesting, and I'm just really happy that you brought it up. Thank you so much.
I wanted to bring up, the next one because it's important, home ownership, in my estimation, in closing the wealth gap, which has been a priority of mine and a priority of this committee. And as you've just correctly stated, your key component of achieving that is helping individuals build up equity through home ownership. Again, because of the price of homes skyrocketed, student borrowers, especially those of color, view home ownership as unattainable. And that's why I am so happy that you've already taken on how you calculate student loan debt in its underwriting process to better reflect what student borrowers actually pay monthly, which is not often the sticker price, which gives them an opportunity to become homeowners, build equity in their homes, and thereby closing the wealth gap. So that's so tremendously important. Maybe I should just ask you, can you just explain a little bit more how you're implementing that policy and your forecast of how impactful that change will be for student borrowers, and especially those of color?
Well, think about it this way, if I can just give you a very quick example. Prior to our making the change, a person that makes about $50,000 a year and has about $75,000 worth of student debt could not be approved for a house that costs $225,000. They can now. That's the difference. So, and the other thing I think that's so important is the fact that we make an assumption that if you have a lot of student debt, then some reason you're not creditworthy. But I know when I went to school, my mother would have paid anything, every dime she had, to make sure I had a good education. And so it's not a matter of not being able to pay. We know most people who can afford an apartment can afford a home. The good thing is that HUD actually secures more than 50% of all first-time home buyers' mortgages. And it's something that comes within our shop, so we can make a difference.
You are making a difference. I don't know how much time I have left. How much?
A minute.
A minute? Let's see. So, but I'll go till they stop me. Let me also ask, and I'm sure that on this committee, one of the other things, I'm a product of public housing in New York City. And there's a big issue in the question of repairing public housing. In New York City, public housing, many of the buildings there, the one that I grew up in, for example, is now 60 years old. And I recently went to visit, and you see beyond repair a number of the apartments. And so I'm hoping that in looking at some of these older institutions, and New York City's housing authority is the largest housing authority in the country, that we are looking at ways of which we can make sure that we can rehabilitate the apartments so that individuals can live in decent apartments in a timely fashion of which they can afford.
We are looking at it.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Huizinga, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair and Madam Secretary up here. I do want to do one little piece of housekeeping here.
No, I'm running back in.
Lots of discussion, obviously, about whether Chair Yellen ought to be sitting with you today. Just to clear the air on that, Secretary Yellen last appeared at this committee at the invitation of the chair with Chair Powell. I think I called her Chair Yellen there, but former Chair Yellen, Secretary Yellen, was invited to this committee with Chair Powell to do a joint CARES quarterly meeting. That was in March. They were supposed to be back in June. They have not been back. She has not been back, and at that March meeting is when she had made some commitments about getting back to this committee. So there's no intention of disrespect to anyone. I'm sure there was no intention of disrespect to anybody back in March when both Secretary Yellen and Chair Powell were invited to a joint hearing on this.
On to some of the issues that we're talking about today. I have to tell you, I was a little taken aback when I think in response to my colleague from California, you mentioned that people can't, quote, I wrote this down, quote, people can't afford to live in California anymore. I think a lot of us see that and realize that, and I think a lot of people in California are seeing that and realizing it, which is why they're moving out of California. What is I think, disturbing or maybe certainly confusing for a lot of us is, then does that simply mean because California has made California very expensive to live in, that it's the rest of the country's responsibility to then subsidize those rents and to subsidize that cost structure that California has imposed upon its own citizens? And this could go for any state, whether it's in Michigan or whether it's in New York or whether it's in California. So I want to talk a little bit about a program in Michigan here. And you've expressed your strong support for down payment assistance as a means of increasing minority home ownership. Certainly an important goal for many of us. When I was in the state legislature in Michigan, I chaired the Commerce Committee. I worked on a number of housing issues at that time, and I'm happy to be on the subcommittee that is continuing to have that. But I have to say I was a little surprised to see that HUD announced recently that it would be pursuing rulemaking that would restrict FHA financing for loans with this type of assistance. And in my home state of Michigan, the Michigan State Housing Development Authority runs a successful program that provides Michiganders with up to $10,000 towards the purchase of their first home. So could you shed some light on what HUD hopes to accomplish with this particular rule, and can you assure me that it won't negatively impact successful programs like the one operated by Michigan's Housing Finance Authority?
Which rule are you referring to?
There had been an announcement that it would be pursuing a rulemaking regarding FHA financing loans that have this assistance, down payment assistance.
I am thoroughly confused. Can you tell me,
So my understanding is that there was an announcement by HUD that, I can't open the link because I actually am using paper, but the link to it being cited, that it is going to be pursuing rulemaking on this this down payment assistance program. So are you saying that there is not going to be a rulemaking?
let me say this to you, since I'm not sure what rule you're talking about, and it's not clear to me. All of our work is to advance down payment assistance. We want home ownership. We would do nothing.
Okay, so then you, reclaiming my time here, so you can assure me that it won't negatively impact state programs like the one that we have in Michigan?
Yes.
Wonderful. We will hold you to that. So now on to that, staying on that issue, one of the bills we're examining today would create a new down payment assistance program that would be housed within HUD with a price tag of $100 billion. That program would actually be larger than your entire annual budget that this administration has even increased. So given that there is approximately 2,500 national, state, and local programs like the one operated by Michigan's Housing Finance Authority that are already providing these down payment assistance to first-time home buyers, I might add without using taxpayer dollars, do you think that we need to be spending limited resources duplicating these efforts with the federal program?
The gentleman's time has expired.
I'll pursue that with a written question.
Thank you. The gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Scott, who is also the chair of the House Agricultural Committee, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair Lady. I appreciate that. Secretary Fudge, I am so proud of you. You and I have served together in the House for many years, and you are doing a wonderful job. Now, I want to pick this up in a way and deal with two issues. I want to get to the rental one because that has raised some issues as well. But I think it's very important because we got the nation watching this, And while I'm on that, Chair Lady Waters, you are absolutely right. It was very important. This was her first chance to come before this committee, and she deserves to have this opportunity on her own. And I respect you and thank you for doing that. Now, I want to set the record straight. First of all, the White House initial infrastructure proposal included a $213 billion investment to create and retrofit over 2 million affordable housing units that were badly and still badly needed. But in the bipartisan infrastructure agreement, that provision did not make the cut. So here we are, working our way through the infrastructure situation, and I think it is fair for us to hear from you. What do you see? What do you want? It is your job to deal with this. Tell us what we must do, how much money we need to make sure is here to get the job done.
Thank you very, very much. But just a couple of things to frame this for you. There is no place in America today where a person making minimum wage can afford a 2-bedroom apartment. Nowhere, not just California, nowhere. And so we know that we need affordable housing. Mr. Scott, I would say to you that we are anticipating and very hopeful that in the reconciliation and the Build Back Better plan, the resources will be there to build at least 2 million. We need far more. We need far more. There are 11 million people in this country today who are spending more than half of their money on rent. It cannot continue. It cannot support itself. And so we know that we need more, but we are hopeful that we will at least get the resources to match what the president is asking us for in the Build Back Better plan.
Thank you. And now let's go to this rental issue. Because we worked hard. We did get nearly $47 billion there. But I want you to, and I think the nation needs to know, that you can execute the program, but much of these funds go down to the various states to implement. How has that been handled? And do you see difficulties in the states fulfilling their obligation? Because in so much of this, I've been involved in this for quite a while. You were with us when we go all the way back to the Hardest Hit program, when we sent billions of dollars down to our states and territories so that we could help homeowners stay in their homes. We're doing the same thing with the renters. We even have moratoriums going on. But tell us how this works, and also tell us, does this money go to the renter? Does it go to the landlord? How does it work?
Well, let me start.
America may need to know.
I'm sorry. Let me start at the back end. The money goes to landlords, so the landlords can be made whole, so that we can get people up to speed and current with their rent. But most importantly, part of the problem has been that when we sent the money to the states and to anything other than a CDBG or formula city or community, the money was held up because they didn't have the assistance or the capacity to get it out fast enough. So what we have been doing, personally, I have been calling mayors and governors and others to say, we got to get the money through the system. So what we're seeing today is that the numbers of resources that are getting out is increasing exponentially every month.
The gentleman's
Thank you.
time has expired. The gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Barr, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and to our former colleague, congratulations on your appointment and confirmation. I do want to echo the comments of the ranking member and my colleagues about the rental assistance, emergency rental assistance program. Perhaps it is right that you're here all by yourself in your first appearance, but it's also right that Secretary Yellen should be here to testify, not just about the mismanagement of this program, but also her statutorily mandated quarterly CARES oversight hearing. I don't know why she hasn't yet appeared. But let's talk about the $46 billion appropriated by Congress and only 4% of it that's actually reached renters. With vaccines distributed and available and many lockdowns ended, taxpayers, I think, are asking the question, either this is too late because people now are working again, or it's not in time because the moratorium on evictions is about ready to expire. So I just think that this is the poster child for why hardworking taxpayers are so critical of big government bureaucratic programs like this. And so I just want to ask you, Madam Secretary, given the fact that you do have an obligation under Section 501G of the law to make a report regarding the use of these ERA funds, you know, what would you say to the taxpayer out there who's frustrated that only 4% of the $46 billion has actually been deployed? You know, and many of these folks are now back at work.
What I would say to the taxpayer is that both Treasury and HUD have done exactly what we were directed to do by this Congress. We have issued the resources. We are providing the assistance. And I would further say that we are required to make reports. There is a quarterly report coming. We don't give daily reports, but there is a quarterly report coming, and I think that it will be more reflective of where we stand.
Can you see why taxpayers would be frustrated that 96% of the funds that Congress appropriated back at the height of the pandemic have still not reached renters? Can you understand why taxpayers would be skeptical of future spending blowouts like this going forward?
I can understand why taxpayers would be concerned if they are at risk of being evicted. There is no question about that. I agree with you.
Well, yeah, so it's to my point, it's for many of these renters, it's either too late, the money's too late getting to them, or if it's not too late, then time is of the essence to deal with the arrears. I know you're working on it. I appreciate that. Just understand, taxpayers are always going to be skeptical about big government programs precisely because of the mismanagement we've seen here. Housing first. I was encouraged by your exchange with Chair Waters earlier when you discussed the need for services in addition to just a roof over a head of a person struggling with housing insecurity. I remain concerned that many transitional housing facilities in my district and around the country, Madam Secretary, are barred from receiving federal homelessness assistance grant funding because they mandate wraparound services such as addiction treatment or job training as a condition for continued residence. In many instances, these requirements are beneficial for specific communities. Facilities like the Franklin County Women and Family Shelter in my district in central Kentucky are left behind because their business model, which is demonstrably effective in our community in getting homeless women into permanent housing and addiction-free lifestyles, doesn't comply with a one-size-fits-all qualification for funding availability. And so, for the sake of clarity, I'm not proposing to end Housing First, but I am proposing that we end the government's exclusive reliance on Housing First. HUD's current policies create a situation that I just described where providers who have an excellent record of successfully transitioning people out of homelessness are excluded from government assistance. Secretary Fudge, are you willing to work with Congress to explore innovative options to expand the universe of successful transitional housing programs that receive federal support?
I'm certainly willing to, and I'd really love to talk to whoever you think we're being unfair to as well.
I'd love to have you. The previous secretary came to my district. There's a lot of faith-based organizations in my district around the country that are not Housing First, but have an excellent track record, and they're being systematically denied federal assistance and discriminated against because they don't have this one-size-fits-all model of Housing First, but they deliver results, and they don't get your help. And so I do want to invite you to the 6th District of Kentucky and other districts around the country in both blue and red districts where we have non-Housing First models that deliver for the homeless population of this country.
The gentleman's time has expired.
Thank you. I yield back.
The gentleman said the Secretary of the Treasury should be here. The Secretary of the Treasury is not here because the chair did not invite her to be here, because she should not be here. With that, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green, who is also the chair of the Subcommittee on Oversight and Investigations, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I would add to your commentary, had we now the Secretary of the Treasury, we would be asking for the Secretary of HUD. This is all about a major distraction. My colleagues on the other side, many of them, not all, oppose a minimum wage. Many of them fight against a living wage. They oppose subsidies for housing, yet we're willing to spend billions on nuclear arms, Nimitz-class aircraft carriers, bombers. But they oppose the things that give people decent living conditions. Housing infrastructure has become a bridge in my district for many people. The infrastructure has become a tent, a lean-to in my district. Too many people are suffering. And Madam Chair, I want you to know that I totally, completely, and absolutely support the Housing as Infrastructure Act of 2021 that you have proposed. I support it because nearly 50% of all U.S. renters are cost burdened and pay 30% or more of their income in housing. 71% of the nation's extremely low-income rental households spend more than half of their incomes on rent and utilities. And as the Secretary has mentioned, there is no state where a full-time minimum wage worker can afford a 2-bedroom unit. As a result of the lack of investment into affordable housing infrastructure, many families pay unaffordable rents or live in substandard conditions. Madam Secretary, do we need to proclaim housing as infrastructure?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think that the best way to describe it, if I may, Mr. Green, when COVID began, the first thing they said to us was, stay home. What happened if you didn't have a home? They said, don't send your children to school. Teach them virtually. What happened if you didn't have a home and you didn't have high-speed internet or broadband? They said, if you get sick, stay home. What do you do without a home?
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I will yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. The gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. Lucas, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And it's wonderful to see my old friend here, Madam Secretary. And before we begin much more discussion, I would just note, I think some of the concern, and the Secretary knows the way my mind works, some of the concern on my side of the room is that when the eviction moratorium ends on July 31, if we don't have those resources flowing, there's going to be a bunch of folks who are going to be in a terrible jam at sunrise on August 1st. So it's a legitimate concern, I think, shared by both sides. How do we make sure that doesn't happen on the first day of August? That said, thank you for being here. For those of you who have not served on another committee that the Secretary and I served on for a long time, you wouldn't know that we work together on a variety of conservation-related issues and rural development. And from the Secretary, I learned more about algae bloom in the Great Lakes than I might have otherwise ever have known. So I appreciate that relationship that we've had. And you're in a unique position. Typically, not always, but typically House members don't become cabinet secretaries and step up to that level of responsibility in the executive branch. So you have a vantage point, a view that most of us will never have. If you don't mind sharing for just a moment or two the things that have caused you frustration, But by the same token, the things that have been a positive surprise to you in your new role, things you would not have had a knowledge of sitting on this side of the dais.
Thank you. It's good to see you, my friend, as well. The thing that I think has probably disappointed me most is that I find that as I come here or in other places, there is an assumption that we don't work hard to do the work to serve the American people. We do. I inherited an agency that is overworked, understaffed, and yet they still do everything they can to take care of the people we serve. I think sometimes we forget about the people. That has disappointed me. I think the thing that has encouraged me most is that the people, whether they tenants organizations, whether I travel around the country and talk to people, they know we care enough to fight to make it right. That is what has encouraged me. People have hope that we're going to make it right. And I feel real good about that.
Our time in working together on the Ag Committee, I think we were old-time legislators, and we worked to achieve consensus. In your role as CBC chairman, you were critically important in helping put the 2014 Farm Bill together, a comprehensive document that addresses everything from producing food to people's ability to have enough to eat. That seems to be out of style these days and has been for some time. I hope in your role as a secretary that you'll continue that spirit as you work with us. And as I allude for a moment back to the concern about July 31, there are some real challenges that are coming up that face real people back home. Sometimes we all get a little excited and we pump a lot of adrenaline here on both sides of the room and on both sides of the building. But the bottom line is we are here to represent those citizens back home, to make sure they all have the ability to put that foot on the first rung of the ladder to carry themselves on up, and that we make things happen. So as you address this issue about what happens after July 31, understand it is a sincere concern by many people. We don't come up on what will be another catastrophe for good folks. And along with that, if you don't mind, I'm a big proponent of bringing the COVID-19 pandemic to an end, and that is using science and technology to its very best. We now have a variety of vaccines that are making a real difference out there. Can you discuss in your final moments how HUD has worked to leverage the available resources to make sure that there's access to those COVID-19 vaccines?
Yes, two things. Let me just say, I am concerned as well. There is no way that I want to see people put on the street or evicted from their apartments or removed from their homes. I'm also concerned. And so we are doing everything we can to prevent it. We know that we have a short time frame, but we know that every single month we're getting to more and more people, and that little additional 30 days is going to make a significant difference. As it relates to making sure that people are vaccinated, we are at a point now where we have to take extraordinary steps. We are already doing vaccination clinics in public housing facilities. We're already doing them in almost any pop-up situation we can find, working along with HUD, with HHS.
Thank you, my friend. Yield back, Chair.
Thank you. The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Cleaver, who is also the chair of the Subcommittee on Housing, Community Development, and Insurance, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Secretary Yellen, I want to know a couple of things that I think my colleague just raised, and that's the whole issue of the vaccines. And as you may know, Missouri is on fire with COVID for the last week or so, leading the nation in new cases and hospitalizations. I don't know how many individuals who are living in public housing or some form of HUD housing or or involved in this crisis. But is there a plan that is being implemented, in HUD housing that is in some way trying to guide residents into accessing the COVID vaccine?
There are a couple of things happening. One is we are working with HHS to be sure that the vaccine is in the places where we believe it is needed most. There still are some minor access issues, but the bigger issue is the educational portion of it. Because when you talk about Missouri is on fire, but it is a fire that is caused by unvaccinated people, most of who choose to be unvaccinated. And there's really not a whole lot we can do about that other than to continue to tell them why they should be vaccinated and to continue to make available the vaccine. It's in every single pharmacy. We have pharmacies that are staying open now every Friday, 24 hours a day, to be sure that people can't, don't have a problem with getting off of work. 24 hours every single Friday. We have, if you want to drop your kids off at daycare, we've got a place that will do that for you. Everything that we can think of to do, we are doing to make sure the vaccine is available.
Thank you. The other issue, and I'm sure you're getting a lot of inquiries about this, but manufactured housing and tiny housing, we're having, like many other places, having difficulties finding places in our community, in the urban part of my district. And so we're struggling. Some places are saying, that some areas are rejecting tiny homes, some reject manufacturing housing, almost all of them reject it, no matter what the housing is, if it's related to housing those who are without any shelter. There's nothing HUD can do to remove this not in my backyard philosophy. But are there any success stories in the tiny home process or manufactured homes?
Manufactured homes is something, of course, we interact with all the time. You can build a manufactured home for something very reasonable, someplace in the $100,000 range. They are fast to put up, they are easily installed, and they are an alternative, I believe. But the problem we have, and you know yourself as a former mayor, zoning and planning create lots of problems for us. And so what we are trying to do now is engage communities to talk about the zoning such that it increases the cost of housing, it keeps people out, and that's even in addition to not in my backyard. So there are issues that we are working on, and we do believe that until we start to address it, that we are going to continue to always perpetually be in this kind of a situation.
You hit on something I think that I want to address with the U.S. Conference of Mayors, and that is, and maybe we need a conference with mayors to talk about this whole issue of zoning. I was on a call with people involved in housing from around the country last week, and everybody was talking about the same issue that you just raised, and that is zoning. And I think we need to have a revolution in how we do zoning, because we are zoning poverty, and it needs to change. I don't know. At some point, I think maybe HUD should consider some kind of program with mayors to just get mayors to understand the problem that's going to continue until we begin to address the issue of zoning.
And let me just say, I was in Denver last week. Denver, the average price of a home in Denver is $700,000. In Boulder, it's over $800,000.
Jeez.
The thing that they were complaining about, not necessarily more housing, they can't get workers. And why? Because workers can't live there. They can't live close enough to be there. So not only do they have a housing crisis, they have a worker shortage. And so they're just things we have to address.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Williams, is now recognized.
Madam Chair, point of order.
Yes. The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you. I would like to request unanimous consent during my questioning about the rulemaking with the Secretary. We either miscommunicated or you were unaware about a rule that was proposed spring of 2021. It's titled Mortgage Insurance for Mortgage Transactions Involving Down Payment Assistance Programs. Alyssa Saunders is the contact. This is through OMB, the website reginfo.gov. And so I'd like to submit it for the record and then
Without objection, such is the
Thank
order.
you.
Thank you very much. The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Williams, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I want to join my colleagues in expressing my disappointment also with how emergency rental assistance aid is still sitting idle while renters and landlords are waiting for help. So Secretary Fudge, good to have you here today. As you are aware, bank participation in the FHA program has dropped dramatically in the last several years. And in speaking with some of my friends back home in Texas, the Texas bankers, they say this is because of two main factors. The first is the high cost of servicing FHA loans, and the second is enforcement actions taken under the False Claims Act. Several major FHA lenders were hit with unreasonable fines for what amounted to non-material underwriting errors under this act, which has caused many to simply stop participating in the program rather than run the risk of being fined for minor errors. And in response, the FHA made some changes to the quality control process, and the Department of Justice put in place a memorandum of understanding to try to create some more certainty within the industry. I'm sure that we all agree that banks need to be held accountable for major violations of this act if they were intentionally trying to defraud the government. However, I also don't think we should expose lenders to high penalties for minor violations, and the housing market might be stronger if we had more competition, which I'm a big supporter of, and competing banks participating in this program. So my question is, can you provide us with some assurances that the Department of Justice MOU will remain in place, and then go into detail, any detail you want on additional steps that the FHA is taking to attract more banks back in the FHA lending program?
Certainly, we're always willing to take a look at things, but I would suggest to you FHA is probably in a better position than it's been in a very, very long time. And secondly, I think that as it relates to the false claims, I know that that is being worked on, and so I'm happy to have a conversation with anybody on your staff about it.
Okay. My last question is about the FHA again, and its multifamily department. I've been told there are massive wait times for some apartment deals to go through, with people having to wait between 6 months to a year before even being assigned an underwriter. And I've seen this a lot. These delays are making it less attractive for private developers to come in and invest their money to increase the supply of affordable housing that we need across the country. And I saw that the FHA contracted some of the underwriting work to the private sector, but so far it has not had any impact on reducing these wait times. So, Secretary Fudge, what are you doing and the work through this, to work through this backlog of multifamily deals so we can increase our housing supply and ensure developers are able to deploy capital in a timely manner and get people in homes?
You're absolutely right. In the past, that has been what has happened. We are on top of it. We are changing the process. We are streamlining the process. I think going forward, they will see a much shorter period of time.
Well, in the end, it helps those looking for homes to live in.
Absolutely.
Thank you for being here. With that, I yield my time back.
The gentlewoman from Ohio, Mrs. Beatty, who is also the chair of the Subcommittee on Diversity and Inclusion, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to Secretary Fudge. Let me start by simply saying the title of this hearing is Oversight on HUD. I'll just cut it short. HUD. It is not oversight of HUD in the United States Treasury. And for the record, Madam Chair, I wanted to note, I do not expect Secretary Fudge to be accountable for Secretary Yellen. I do not expect her to answer or speak for her, nor did I expect Secretary Carson to speak for Secretary Mnuchin. And I know he couldn't. He could barely defend why he took 16.4% of HUD's budget before he got started. I'd like to remind my colleagues that she has only been in this position for about 6 months. So let me educate my colleagues and those listening. She has crisscrossed the United States for housing. She came to the state of Ohio and met with a bipartisan team of housing experts. Let me also say, to allocate 100% of the rental housing funds to state and local government, we should be saying thank you. In my district alone, having them receive the money, now that part my colleagues got correct. We should be applauding her for getting all the dollars there for rental assistance. Now, it went to the state and local governments to do that. Let me share with you and paraphrase what she said to state and local governments in the capital city of Ohio, with including our mayor sitting there. She said, allocate the funds. Allocate the funds and help these individuals who are in need. Let me also thank you for in the few months that you have been there to increase the housing instability and homelessness caused by the pandemic that put us in a whole new tizzy and world. Thank you for the investments in the nation's housing infrastructure as part of the Biden's Build Back Better plan. Rolling back actions of the Trump administration, which set us back and undermined the Fair Housing Act. So thank you. Now, I do have a question if I have enough time. I want to say thank you to your entire team. They have been amazing in responding and reaching out. Earlier this year, I have a bill, the Housing Financial Literacy Act, that passed the House with overwhelming bipartisan support. This bill would give FHA borrowers a 0.25 basis point discount up front on their mortgage insurance for first-time home buyers in exchange for taking an HUD-approved pre-purchase housing course. And this bill lowered the down payment rate for first-time home buyers by more than $500 on an average, and likely lowered the default rate within the FHA's portfolio. So under the current law, the FHA has the authority to implement this program, which it did between 1996 and 2000. So would you consider asking your team to re-implement this discount program for the first time, home buyers?
Sorry, yes, we are really pushing that towards the front of the line, so we're having discussions about it.
Thank you. And is there anything in my last minute that I'd be honored to yield you that time to say anything you'd like to say to this committee?
Thank you so much. I would say to this committee, I've not been gone that long. I understand your concerns. I'm doing everything that I possibly can do to make sure that we are good stewards of the resources we have been given. Just give me the time to make it happen. I've been there 4 months. When I was sitting on your side of the table, I would probably have been asking the same questions, so I'm good with that. But know that I know how to do it, we have the people to do it, and we will do it.
Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you very much. The gentleman from Arkansas, Mr. Hill, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and once again, Secretary Fudge, great to have you before the committee. And again, let me add to all my colleagues our congratulations for your service to your country as our HUD Secretary. I listened to the Chairwoman talk about what might have been last summer in terms of getting the rental assistance money started sooner. But last summer, the Congress was faced with sort of an all-or-nothing play. We were going to pass the HEROES Act or have no discretion to target money that we really felt on a bipartisan basis needed to be targeted. And so we went for days and days without starting the Paycheck Protection Program back up. It expired on August 5th last year, and we could have gotten a targeted bipartisan relief on rental assistance, but we didn't. So it passed in December. And $25 billion of that money in the appropriations bill has been 100% allocated to the states. And the $21 billion that was in the American Rescue Package, only 50% of that money has been allocated. So it hasn't all been allocated. I want to correct the record that, in fact, it has not been all allocated. So I think that's an important point. And the ranking member noted the Washington Post story by Rachel Siegel, 5-alarm fire, slow trickle of rental aid heightens concern about evictions crisis. Madam Chair, I'd like to submit this article for the record.
Without objection, such is the order.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And in this article, there's a quote from Diane Yentl, President and CEO of the National Low-Income Housing Coalition, and she says, setting up rental assistance programs from scratch is a major and time-consuming undertaking. True. But by now, repeat, by now, that's no excuse for the abysmally slow pace of spending in some communities. So I think that's lays the stage. And so I ask you, Madam Secretary, who should be held accountable for getting this money out? Just within the administration, who's the point person, in your view, to get this money out to our tenants and our landlords that need it?
The people who now have it, which is the cities and the states. Diane Yennel is absolutely right. It took some time to stand up the new program. The resources are there. That is why I'm constantly calling mayors and governors and other people to say, you are the cog in this. Get it out. They know they have the resources. They will say to me, especially smaller communities, well, we didn't have the people to do it. We don't know how to do it. So we provide that assistance to them. But it is their responsibility because they have the resources. It's no different than if it's CDBG money or any other kind of formula money or competitive money. Once they receive it, they are responsible for it. We are responsible for the oversight, but they are responsible for the program.
But it is a challenge when some of these states have never done that before, and that was the decision by Congress. And so I really think the Treasury Secretary and you have really the disproportionate responsibility to try to set those parameters and get that out, because the money was distributed in January, and here we are almost the 1st of August. And as I said in my opening comments, a tiny portion, just 0.7% of that money in Arkansas has been spent, and 4% overall. Let me switch subjects if I might. You referenced 50-year-old housing unit stock and made that a point. And HUD, over the years, starting with the Obama administration, has had its Rental Assistance Demonstration Program, the RAD program, started in 2011 to preserve and maintain affordable housing by allowing public housing authorities to convert public housing units into a Section 8 project-based rental assistance. HUD Secretary for President Obama, Sean Donovan, created that program, and he said, the administration created RAD as a comprehensive and innovative strategy that offers long-term solution to preserve and enhance the country's vital affordable housing stock by finding ways to get private capital off the sidelines and back into communities. Donovan goes on to say, RAD is a model of smart government. So my question to you is, do you agree with Secretary Donovan that RAD is smart government?
I think it's a great program because the thing about it is it still is maintained as a public housing. They don't own it. The private industries don't own it. They have leveraged the resources, but it's a program we're looking at. Because the one thing we have to be very, very careful about, and I know that members of Congress are, is that we don't start to go down a road of privatizing public housing.
All right, let me ask you one follow-up quickly. Do you support lifting the statutory cap that currently limits RAD participation to a maximum of 455,000 units?
Well, I don't know that we're still looking at it, but I would suggest to you that I think that we should consider raising it, yes.
Thank you. I yield back, Madam Chair.
Gentleman yields back. The gentlewoman from Pennsylvania, Ms. Dean, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Secretary Fudge, welcome back. It's a delight to be here with you, and we're delighted that you are here alone speaking about homelessness, affordable housing, repairs to our housing stock, and increases to our housing stock. When you talk about how we were all told to stay home when COVID hit, it's very poignant that hundreds of thousands of people in this country had no place to call home, and that continues to this day. I represent suburban Philadelphia, Montgomery County, and Berks County. We have the Montgomery County Public Housing Authority, which serves a large portion of Montgomery County, Pennsylvania. It has a portfolio of 625 units and a waiting list of over 20,000 unique applicants. Simply put, and you have said it over and over, there is not enough affordable housing for those who need it. Could you tell us from the American Jobs Plan, with some specificity, how that proposal, this transformational American Jobs Plan, will make an impact on that tremendous need that is in my district, and I imagine is mirrored throughout this country?
Thank you very much for the question. As a nation, we have not, at any time in recent history, for decades, invested in public housing or new moderate and low-income housing. We just have not done it. And so time has finally caught up with us. That is where we find ourselves today. So the president in the American Jobs Plan recognized the fact that millions and millions of people need housing. So in that plan originally, if you recall, there was $300 billion set aside just to do housing. There is a new housing tax credit to incentivize persons to build new housing. That is in addition to the low-income housing tax credits. The plan right now looks like it's about $200 billion, but neither the amount of money, it's the housing. 2 million new units, up to 500,000 renovated and rehabilitated units. Units that are energy efficient, units that are resilient, and units that will keep the cost down for the people who live in them. It is the most significant piece of housing legislation in my lifetime.
It's very exciting, and I do hope we will get it across the finish line with really broad bipartisan support. You referenced another problem in my district, which is many of our housing units are 40 years or more old. We've had the opportunity through some investment to renovate some and reconstruct another, but really the capital needs are very, very great. Just outside my district in Philadelphia, more than 60% of the housing stock was built more than 50 years ago. Do you believe that the American Jobs Plan funds will be able to cover the full scope of what is needed? If you had a magic wand, what would be needed to make the repairs so that these are decent, as you say, energy efficient, safe, warm, dry places?
$40 billion is really a down payment. We know that we need so much more. It is estimated anywhere between $70 billion and $100 billion or more. But what we do know is $40 billion is a great down payment to start to make the change we need to make. And it is a commitment that I believe that housing authorities and others are welcoming because they know we've never, ever given them these kinds of resources. So do I think it's enough? No. Do I think it's a great start? Yes.
Terrific, thank you. I want to switch now to something else I care passionately about, which is ensuring proper housing for those who suffer from the disease of substance use disorder, addiction, or those with mental health ailments. We know oftentimes these people are unable to find affordable, proper housing when that is precisely what they need to stabilize their lives, receive treatment, and begin to heal. What efforts is HUD leading for these populations of people either struggling with the disease of addiction or mental health issues? What's HUD doing about housing for them?
There is a carve-out in the jobs plan that asks for billions of dollars for housing for the disabled, which would include the population that you are referencing.
Thank you very much, and I hope we make sure it's a robust carve-out for those. And offline, because I see my time is up, we did signal over to your team that we want to talk about the problem of the definition of group homes for those who are in recovery and unlicensed group homes that are sometimes taking grave advantage of people who are in the greatest of need. Thank you, Madam Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you very much. The gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Kostoff, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Madam Secretary, for appearing today. Let's see if you would welcome the opportunity to talk about something other than what we've talked about here before, and that is opportunity zones, if I could. We know that the opportunity zones were created in the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017. In my state of Tennessee, last count I saw, we had 176 opportunity zones, 32 in Shelby County, which is the Memphis area, which is an area that I represent with Congressman Steve Cohen. And in 2019, I had the opportunity to tour one of those zones, an area called, it was called Union Road, it's now called The Walk. That's actually in Congressman Steve Cohen's district. I toured that with your predecessor, Secretary Carson. If I could, Madam Secretary, could you talk about the Biden administration's position right now? Is the Biden administration, in fact, open to expanding opportunity zones?
Well, I don't think they've taken a position at all at this point, but certainly we are going to be talking about it because not only have Senate members mentioned it as well, but it is something that some people feel very, very good about, so we'll be having further conversations about it.
And to that point, Madam Secretary, can you talk about what specific changes, if any, or reforms that the administration would look at to the existing opportunity zones, or to further opportunity zones, if you would, please?
I don't know because we've not had the discussions.
Okay, thank you. Could you also, Madam Secretary, talk about the Biden administration and where the Biden administration stands right now as to the Biden Appraisal Task Force that HUD was garnered with the leadership of?
Yes, as a matter of fact, I'm the chair of the task force, and what we are talking about is what we know to be true, that we have, throughout this nation's history, looked at property in certain communities, primarily those that are Black and brown, and undervalued those homes. I live in an all-Black community by choice. My home is undervalued compared to the community right next door to me, literally within walking distance. But my home is valued as much as $20,000 less than a comparable home in another community. We want to level the playing field.
You know, I hear from a number of FHA borrowers that they say they can't compete in today's market, that sellers are refusing to entertain offers using FHA financing due to concerns with certain minimum property requirements, maybe with appraisal issues, concerns over the quality of the loan itself. Can you talk about what FHA is doing to combat the narrative and hopefully try to address these issues?
Well, the first thing is they can't be using appraisals at this point. We just started the committee. So if they've been having problems in the past, it certainly wasn't that. And I don't think that there is anything that I see no basis. If they're concerned, they need to raise what those exact concerns are. But there is nothing that has been changed to this point that would create a problem for them.
I could, one last area, and I appreciate you allowing me to jump to different issues. This involves the Community Development Block Grant Program. And I think we can all agree that it served a vital role. My question really is, with Formula B, which uses pre-1940 housing units variable in determining grant sizes, my position would be that that essentially allows cities with large populations 80, 90 years ago to receive larger grants. And I'll use, again, my city of Memphis as an example. In the year 2020, the city of Baltimore received 3 times as much funding as Memphis, despite Baltimore having a lower population and poverty rate than Memphis in current times. Can you address, if you can address, whether you think that CBDG, whether the formula is outdated and in fact does need to be modernized?
I certainly think we need to take a look at it, just like we do so many other formulas in HUD. So we are in the process of evaluating where we stand. Absolutely, I think we should look at it.
And I do appreciate that answer. If you could, I would appreciate if your staff could follow up with my staff on any thoughts and any proposals, and maybe we could share ideas.
Be happy to.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. And with that, Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman's time is expired. The gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Garcia, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you so much for this very important hearing and our invitation to Madam Secretary. And Madam Secretary, it just sounds so great to say that. In fact, I'm going to say it again. Madam Secretary, welcome to your first hearing before Financial Services. I know many of us are join you and stand with you in your success. And if there's anything that I or my office can do, please do not hesitate to call. I want to focus on housing, of course, particularly access to housing. Research shows that access to housing equals a healthy, productive society. Access to housing means access to building generational wealth. It also means closing the racial wealth gap. It is estimated that between 2020 and 2040, 70% of new homeowners will be Latino. And Freddie Mac found that in 2019, there were 8.3 million mortgage-ready Latinos age 45 and under. The National Association of Hispanic Real Estate Professionals found that the top producing real estate firms are the ones that offer bilingual services throughout all stages of the home buying process. In light of this, it is important that we think about how we can use language access to expand access to housing. It is great to see that HUD's housing counseling agencies provide multilingual services. And as you said about the homeless, if we don't provide services, we set them up for failure. And we want our home buyers to succeed. This is a critical service that's important to home buyers struggling to navigate such a cumbersome financial decision. The American Rescue Plan provided $100 million for housing counseling to help struggling families stay in their homes. But housing counselors do not always have the ability to assist homeowners with legal help when they need it. Is HUD reviewing how they can connect housing counseling with legal aid services in the future? And if so, how is HUD working with counseling agencies and legal aid services to ensure access for homeowners who do not primarily speak English?
Yes, we right now have about $20 million from actually funds that were allocated by Congress to assist with legal issues, especially it was designed, of course, for those who are facing eviction, but it can be used for other things. So we do have $20 million in-house now that came from the rescue plan. In addition to which, we do know as well that the wealth gap or the gap between home ownership for Black and white Americans is as wide today as it was in 1968. And so we understand very clearly the need to be sure that we can bring in Black and brown people in a way that is comfortable to them. So we do have resources and we are working on it daily to make sure
and
that
they
we
will
can
also address services for those who cannot speak English or have
language, yes.
Well, thank you so much. And, you know, there's much being said about how many dollars have actually been spent. And I think it's clear that you've said that 100% of the dollars have been obligated that were received. And we all know, as you've also stated, that the problem becomes you send it to the states, and then the states do not pull it out there quickly enough, or sometimes they sort of play with the money and don't do quite what we asked them to do. And as you know, you and I have visited about the situation with the CDBG dollars for disaster mitigation in Houston. And as they were handled in Texas, we had a hearing about that last week. And it's just another example of how the dollars are sent, but the governors, sometimes, you know, governors from the other side of the aisle, in our case, they just decide to either delay or do their own formulas or do whatever they want to with the dollars. What can we do as lawmakers to prevent those situations from happening? What other guardrails, what other, you know, procedures can we do? And is it possible that some of these dollars go directly to cities like Houston, who can probably handle the dollars and have the resources and staff to quickly get those dollars out the door?
Well, the good thing is cities like Houston do get it directly because they are entitlement cities, anything over 50,000 people. But I would say that I was in this body long enough to have heard many, many times, states have their rights, they should be able to do what they want to do. Cities have their rights, they should be able to do what they want to do. Now they want me to control it. And so there's only so much we can do based upon the way that the law is written. So, but we are enforcing it as best we can.
Thank you. I yield back. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. The gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Laudermilk, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Secretary, it's good to see you again, and congratulations on your new role. As you know, primary funding source for many housing authorities is this monthly drawdown from HUD. However, guidance from the Office of Chief Financial Officer states that HUD auditors do not recognize interim directors, so only permanent officials can obtain drawdowns. What that means is when a housing authority has an interim director as a transition period, it may not be able to access HUD funds. Interim directors were able to do this, to do drawdowns in the past. I'm not sure why the policy changed, but this is becoming a problem, and it is a problem with small cities, especially with small staffs. It recently happened in my district. The city of Canton had an interim director, and they were unable to draw down the money that they needed. They were able to come to a one-time resolution with HUD, but there are thousands of state and local housing authorities in the country that frequently have executive directors leave their position and an interim director is appointed. Understand the intent of the policy is to potentially prevent fraud, but there needs to be some kind of process for interim directors to access the downloads. So my question would be, is this something that you can look into and find a permanent solution so housing authorities, especially during this time period we're in right now, don't have to go through so many hoops to, if they have an interim director in the middle of the change, to where they can actually access the funds for their folks?
Absolutely, because if that's the case, we do need to look into it. There should be nothing, that should not be an impediment to a drawdown.
Well, I appreciate that, and like I said, with the city of Canton, Georgia, recently they had to go through this. They were able to work through a one-time solution, but if they don't have an executive director by the time the next month comes in, they're gonna have to go through that again. So, on another issue, I'd like to echo some of the concerns that's been raised regarding mismanagement of emergency rental assistance funds. The bipartisan December omnibus provided a structure for a $25 billion rental assistance program, but instead of continuing with that program, Democrats established an entirely new partisan program from scratch. This has created two different sets of rules for state and local governments to follow and has resulted in less than 4% of the funds being distributed so far. This has created some of potentially worst legislating that I've seen, with two different programs with two different sets of rules that already cities and states are trying to work through those. So the question is, if Congress consolidated the two programs into one, would that help get the funds out to renters more quickly?
I think that Congress should do what they believe is best. You know, I can't make a decision, a judgment based on what Congress will do. But I would say that the more streamlined, the better. What HUD does is follow the rules. When Congress tells us how to do something, that is what we do.
Well, I understand that, but with two sets of rules for two different types of programs that won't accomplish the same thing, it gets very convoluted. And already states and local governments have enough trouble dealing with federal government. But and with only 4% of the funds making it down there, it seems to me that if we could get a functioning rental assistance program into place, would there be a need for an eviction moratorium?
Well, I think that the one thing that we don't talk about is that the fact that these funds were put in place because of an emergency situation. I think coming out of COVID, either way we would have needed it because of COVID. I don't know that as a general rule we would, but certainly because of COVID, I would say yes.
All right, and even with COVID, only 4% being distributed, it seems to me that if we could just get the monies to the people who need it, you wouldn't have to have the eviction moratorium. So with that, Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you. The gentlewoman from Iowa, Ms. Axney, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman, and thank you, Secretary Fudge, for being here. It's great to have you here today. I want to start with a question on rental assistance. I know this has been run out of the Treasury, but I also know that HUD has been helping state and local groups trying to run those programs. Iowa State's program has not done well in getting this aid out. I believe at the end of June, they'd given out just about 2% of the funding they'd received. However, I don't quite understand why my Republican colleagues here on the other side of the aisle are so hung up on the Treasury here. I've got a local program in Polk County that has now given out more than 2/3 of the funding. It is the largest, most populated county in the state. So we can get it out there and to the folks who need it, but apparently our state government can't. So clearly this is not a question of the rules preventing it. It's about really communities who have the will and the knowledge to get the funding out and support the people properly. So Secretary Fudge, my question is, can you share some of what HUD sees as best practices here so we can encourage our state to adopt those?
The easiest thing is for communities, whether it be the state or the county or whoever, to work with people who do this every day. Most people who are at risk of eviction either have worked with social workers or we know who their landlords are. We need to do the work. They need to do the work. They want it to be easy, but they have to start to talk with people on the ground who are doing this every day. It's not hard to find out who they are and to get them the resources. but we also have made it somewhat cumbersome for the renters. You know, we assume a certain amount of sophistication for renters to get the resources because we are putting the onus on renters really to come and ask for the resources. So we have to find another way to reach those renters and to get them the kind of information they need to get those resources out.
Well, I look forward to continuing to work with you on those opportunities, and I'll make sure to talk with the state about that. So they sound like good ideas, and I certainly know that, as you mentioned, in Polk County, they actually are working with those local groups. So you're right, it works. I did want to also point out another thing I'm wondering about. Our governor decided not to give people the 3 months of forward rent that they could. And to me, it seems like a pretty clear way to provide help to people without making the same person apply every single month. And it's also going to make administering of this easier as well. So is that something that you've seen elsewhere? And do you agree that this would raise costs if people have to apply repeatedly?
There's no question. And one of the complaints we get is too much paperwork. And so why create additional?
Okay, so it would be a good thing for us to continue to move forward with that rent. It would ease up the pressures on the application process.
Absolutely.
Thank you. So I do hope that our state government can put this in place as it reconsiders passing up the opportunity to help more renters in the second round. I'd like to move on now to something that I think could help with affordable housing across this country, and that's manufactured housing, which I think can be part of our solution to helping get a good, solid roof over folks' heads. However, for those who own the home itself but rent the land, they don't get that benefit if the rent gets jacked up to the levels that they can't afford, or if the landlord kicks them out for no reason, forcing them to sell their home, sometimes at a major loss. I actually had a constituent who had to sell their home for a 40% loss of what she paid for it just 3 years earlier because of these predatory tactics. So, Secretary Fudge, do you think there's more that we can do to make manufactured housing communities work as affordable housing that truly prioritizes the tenants rather than solely focusing on extracting profit?
Yes, we can. And I have spoken with the manufactured housing group. I've also spoken with tenants of not just public housing, manufactured housing as well. And so we are working to try to work through some issues that we think are going to be helpful. But they know that there's a problem, and we know there's a problem. So I do believe it can work.
And are you pulling together best practices from some of those landlords who are doing the right thing?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay, I would love to see some of those if we get a chance. Thank you so much for doing that. It's why I introduced a couple of bills to get these protections in place so things like this don't happen. Just so you know, I've got the Manufactured Housing Tenants Bill of Rights that would increase protections for renters in federally backed properties, and the MHC Preservation Act that provides grants to resident-owned groups and others who might want to step up and own the places themselves and give those benefits to the residents. So I hope we can work together on those to get people more protected and safe in their homes that they currently live in, and also give other folks more opportunity for affordable housing. Thank you so much, Madam Secretary, for all that you're doing, and thank you for helping us move this agenda forward with the American people. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Gonzalez, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and welcome, Secretary Fudge, my friend. It's good to see you. We miss you in Cleveland, but Cleveland is so very proud of you, and we're grateful for your continued service to the country. I want to start off by talking to you about something we've spoken about in private, which is veterans homelessness, something that's a big issue in our country, and certainly a big priority of mine here in Congress. In your written statement, you noted that HUD's mission is to create strong, sustainable, inclusive communities and quality, affordable homes for all. As you know, this certainly means ensuring our veterans have access to affordable housing. After serving our country, I believe no veteran should have to worry about having a roof over his or her head. Currently, throughout the United States, there are still far too many veterans who are homeless and countless more at risk of losing their homes. What more do you think we can be doing through HUD in collaboration with the VA and those who serve our veterans to extend more housing opportunities?
It's a really great question, and I tell you, it's something that I wrestle with every day, and I've had the opportunity to speak with Secretary McDonough. There is no reason, first off, in this nation that anyone should be homeless, but especially those people who have served their nation. with such distinction. And so we are trying to find more ways. We have right now in our system unused at HUD more than 20,000 vouchers for veterans. We have in this budget, the president's budget, when we reauthorize them, almost 100,000. We're just trying to make sure that we can find a way to get to the veterans who are homeless, and we're doing better, certainly. But it takes a concerted effort, because the one thing about veterans is that they are resilient. And so when they get into these communities, they become in charge of these communities. It becomes a culture. So we're breaking down the barriers every day.
That's great. And I look forward to working with your office more on figuring out how we can get those unused vouchers out. If we've already got them out there, let's make sure our veterans are using them and they're getting into their hands. As far as the emergency rental assistance dollars, I know reports are being produced, and that's been a big topic of conversation. In those reports, will there be not special call-outs, but will we be reporting on the status of veteran homelessness in there, or will those be in separate reports?
Well, it's really separate. It'll come through the VA, but I'll make sure that we get you that information
Fantastic.
So that you can have it.
Thank you. And then another issue I know you care passionately about, and that impacts Northeast Ohio disproportionately compared to the rest of the country, is the issue of lead paint in older housing. Ohio has the third most housing choice voucher units in the country built prior to 1978, only behind California and New York. This can have serious impacts on the health and development of children, as we know, who are exposed, and is something I believe we need to address head on. What more can we do on the preventative side to identify housing that has lead-based paint and make sure that Northeast Ohio families are kept safe?
You know it is a passion of mine, and it almost brings me to tears to talk about it. In Cuyahoga County alone, 1,000 children annually are poisoned to the extent they cannot function in the county I live in. All the children in the public schools just about have elevated levels of lead. We must find a way to do something with lead paint in public housing. The resources have been requested in the president's budget, and I just need for people like you, Mr. Gonzalez, to help me fight for it.
Well, I will continue to do just that, and look forward to working with you on the lead paint issue, veterans homelessness, and the priorities of this committee. And with that, I yield back.
The gentlewoman from Massachusetts, Ms. Presley, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman Waters, for convening this important hearing, and thank you to Secretary Fudge for being here today. What a welcome change. I am overjoyed to see that we have someone dedicated to exacting housing justice back at the helm of the Department of Housing and Urban Development. In May 2019, former Secretary Carson came before this committee and refused to answer any of my questions. I asked if he thought safe housing was a social determinant of health. He refused to answer. I asked if he thought substandard housing conditions pose a threat, a risk to tenants' health. He refused to answer. I asked if my constituents deserve to live in housing filled with life-threatening mold. He refused to answer. And then, to no one's surprise, he repeatedly tried to cut funding for long overdue repairs. Unlike the prior administration, Secretary Fudge, which simply avoided the problem and slashed much-needed resources, President Biden, as you alluded to in your opening statement, has proposed a budget and a Build Back Better plan which increases such efforts and includes billions in funding to address the public housing repair backlog and millions to remove lead-based paint and other health hazards. Now, here in Congress, we're working urgently to make good on those proposals and appreciate having good partners in this fight. But there is also work that HUD can do on its own without Congress to improve inspections and repairs to HUD-subsidized units, work that your administration undoubtedly has inherited, but now has an opportunity to address once and for all. With HUD REACT inspections cautiously resuming following the unprecedented pause during the pandemic, we have a responsibility not just to return, again, as you alluded to in your opening statement, to an unjust status quo normal, but to build a new normal, one which ensures that everyone has safe, clean, and a healthy place to call home. Secretary Fudge, how long on average does it take for a property that failed its REAC inspection to make the repairs and then to receive a passing score? Is this data that is currently tracked?
I don't know that we track the exact length because every situation is a little different in terms of the agreements that they have. So what they try to do is make an agreement with the landlord if it's Section 8 or some other. But let me just say this. The reason that I demanded that we start inspections again, to the concern of many people, is because I believe in the dignity of people who live in these places. And so we are trying to speed up the process. What I have asked them to do is give me a list of the worst properties in their areas and when they are going to get in them and look at them. I don't want to hear about concerns they may have. People are depending on us. And so I have asked for the list of the top 10 worst properties in every single community we serve. And it is my expectation that within a 30-day period, they will look at every single one.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. Certainly that transparency is so critical. I'm a believer that that which gets measured gets done, so that transparency is very important. Would you be open to working with our office to perhaps explore ways where this data could be collected and reported in order to ensure that HUD is meeting those oversight responsibilities?
Would be happy to, because we should have already been collecting this data.
Thank you. I certainly, throughout my district, the Massachusetts 7th, I just do continue to hear complaints from constituents that some housing providers take years to make those improvements after having a failing REAC score. Some have shared, in fact, that in past years, they have been skeptical about whether HUD followed up promptly after the provider claimed to make repairs. So again, I appreciate your due diligence on this front. Just a couple of more questions in that vein. When properties fail inspections, are there any strategies currently under HUD to bring properties back into compliance quickly and efficiently? Is there a prompt?
No, there are procedures in place. I just think that for so long, we have been somewhat lax in following up. I think also we go overboard because we know that people need the housing, and so I think in prior administrations, we have been more lenient than I would be. If they are not going to let people live decent, I don't want them to have taxpayers' dollars, period.
Agreed. Certainly simply because someone cannot afford more doesn't mean they don't deserve better. So I thank you for your partnership and your commitment to ensure that the time between a failing REAC score and a completed repair is as short as possible.
Gentlewoman's time has expired. The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Taylor, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Secretary, thank you for being here. I was gratified in your opening comments that you said the United States of America is the greatest nation on earth. I just wanted to give you a chance to say why you thought that. And yes, that is a slow pitch.
No, I think that one of the things that makes us a great nation is that we as a people have always been able to see our problems and to repair our faults. We want to be the leaders of the world. We are the people who lead the world in so many things. Are we a perfect nation? No. Are we a great nation? Yes. We're a great nation because our people are good people.
Thank you. That's a great answer, and I appreciate that. In the vein of trying to correct faults, I'm sure you're aware under current law 18 U.S.C. 1001 that it is a crime to knowingly make material, false, fictitious, or fraudulent statements or representations to the federal government. So in the vein of finding fraud, what are your thoughts on using new technology, artificial intelligence, to find fraud, to stop whether it's a real estate developer that, like what Ms. Presley was talking about earlier, that is not coming through the way they should, or whether it's a pretend tenant that's taking advantage of our programs? I know you have finite resources. Have you thought about artificial intelligence as a way to find fraud?
I really haven't, because it's not been proven to work all the time. And so I would rather err on the side of a person who needs help than not.
What would you think about looking at different programs? I mean, I'll let you think about this, to to use artificial intelligence on a test basis, on a pilot basis, to try, because as we know, many financial institutions are using AI to do underwriting, to eliminate fraud, and to be more effective in the way that they allocate credit. And so if we think about that, reapplying it in this case, try to make sure that we're giving help to where help is needed.
I'm certainly willing to give it some thought. It's not something that I've given any thought to prior to your question. But I mean, we're always trying to make sure that people are treated better, that the federal government operates better. So I'm certainly willing to think about it.
Sure, and obviously, I think we can both agree that your resources are limited, and your needs are great. So you want to, I think we can agree we want to focus resources where they are indeed needed. And in that vein, what are the limits of helping people at HUD? In other words, the financial limits. Like, you can perhaps educate me on what those limits are, and do you think they're perhaps too high?
Which limits? I'm not sure.
Income limits.
Oh, no, I don't think so. I don't think that the income limits are too high at all. I think that as we look at where this nation is evolving as it relates to housing, as it relates to what a dollar can buy you, as it relates to what it costs to buy food or to build housing, I don't think we're too high at all.
Is there a point where you would say that person is making too much money, that we just, hey, you're at 700% of?
Well, yeah, we have rules, of course. We have guidelines.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. I mean, we don't just say any person making any amount of money can be serviced by HUD. I mean, we obviously have guidelines. And most of those are generally 80% of the average median income or less.
Okay, and so 80% is the general standard that HUD uses to determine when someone can no longer receive aid?
Correct.
Okay.
Of the average median income, because every community is different. So the dollar amount is different in every community.
Sure, and I just...
Gentleman's time has expired.
Yes, he has 53 seconds.
There's another few seconds.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I was really glad to hear your comments on zoning. I think that zoning can make housing extremely expensive, and in some places unlivable. And so I just want to say I appreciated your comments. I identify with those. I think zoning can be very hurtful to people in terms of making housing very expensive by putting requirements on housing that just isn't practical. And certainly, I happen to live in a place in Plano, Texas, where we're pretty good about zoning, I think. And so we have relatively affordable housing. It's causing a lot of demand for people coming from other parts of the country, which is driving up our housing prices. And I'm sure, if I could, I'll yield back.
Thank you very much. The gentlewoman from Michigan, Ms. Tlaib, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman. Thank you, Madam Secretary. It is so incredibly good to see you. And thank you for being accessible right from the beginning. In meeting with myself and Congresswoman Capter and I, as you all know, many of the folks on your team know firsthand, the Great Recession devastated many places like Wayne County, and many of these communities have yet to fully recover. In my district, we face tax foreclosure crisis that's still ongoing. And so I just want to thank you so much for including Restoring Communities Left Behind Act that Congresswoman Capter and I are championing in addressing tax foreclosure, but also home improvement in neighborhood, really true grassroots neighborhood revitalization. And again, thank you for that partnership. As you probably know, since 2011, the Wayne County Treasurer has foreclosed on more than 100,000 families for delinquent property taxes, and that's nearly 1 in 4 properties in the entire county. And Madam Secretary, Wayne County, we used to have one of the highest Black home ownership rates in the country. People would envy, like, what are we doing here? And it was something that we always bragged about, and what we saw in 2000, that it went from 53% to now close to 40% in Black home ownership. So again, I applaud you in including tax foreclosure relief in the implementation of the Home Assistance Fund, and I can't thank you enough for including Restoring Communities Left Behind Act.
I also know in the city of Detroit specifically that more than 92% of our homes, though, were overassessed. And if I may, Madam Chairwoman, I would like to insert into the record Detroit homeowners overassessed $600 million. I think it's important to know that's nearly 96,000 homes that were taxed twice as much as they should have. And I think that continues to contribute so much to some of the tax foreclosure issues that we continue to see. And I know you just finished telling a colleague.
Without objection.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Yes.
Pause for that. I know that we don't want you to take on this role about, telling localities what to do. However, to advise or at least make a statement that this is really something that could be violating the Fair Housing Act. Is there anything that HUD can do to end this? Can we, HUD consider withholding CDBG funds to localities that overassess property taxes such a high rate in violation of the Fair Housing Act?
I think there are a couple of things that can be done. First off, we follow the law. And so if there is a fair housing violation, we want to know about it. We will investigate it. And we will do whatever is necessary to make sure we get it corrected. So the first thing I would hope that you would do is contact our office or just tell me, and I will make sure that our fair housing people take a look at it. And there are conversations we can have about resources coming to communities.
Yeah, I'll be more than willing to make sure that there's a study by University of Chicago and many others that show that the overassessment continues. Again, one of the things that I know the department can take steps, and I enjoy the fact that you say you follow the law, because one of the things is to codify and really identify which localities are overassessing homeowners right now and how that's contributing to the tax foreclosure. Has there been any discussions in the previous administration or now about some sort of database or recording of overassessment around the country that you might know of?
Not that I'm aware of, but I will check.
Wayne County property taxes account for 60% of the county's general fund revenue, and you know what that means. That's why I'm hoping to have your partnership and leadership, Madam Secretary, at the federal level, at least to call out when it's wrong to do it, at least show some sort of alignment with property owners, and many of them, again, are Black-owned property owners, that this crisis needs to be addressed, and that HUD, will definitely be able to, or some way, show that this is wrong and that we need to do something about it and push back against many of that effort.
Just want to say, just rest assured, I'm the mayor of a small city that was predominantly Black, and I'm a lawyer by training, so we are going to follow the law. We're going to do what we can to make sure it's done properly.
I appreciate that, Madam Secretary. I'm also extremely grateful, Madam Secretary, in the conversation earlier this year on our bill, and I'm so incredibly happy to see Chairwoman's $10 billion towards the program of the Housing as an Infrastructure Act. Does the administration support this funding? I know you talked a little bit about it, but can you talk about next steps and maybe again, you have this committee, many of us are very much in support of that, of any actions by the administration and pushing that forward.
At this point, it really...
The gentlewoman's time has expired. The gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Rose, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman Waters and Ranking Member McHenry, for convening the hearing today, and welcome Secretary Fudge back to the House and to your first time before our committee. I'm a recovering lawyer as well, so I feel like I have some appreciation for your plight. I think this hearing is long overdue. HUD was tasked with a significant role in response to COVID-19, but in my opinion, unfortunately, has failed to live up to the responsibilities. Specifically, I have been extremely disappointed with the slow rollout of rental assistance programs, as well as HUD's development and implementation of confusing guidelines. Congress appropriated $46 billion in rental assistance, and as we've heard repeatedly today, almost 7 months after that initial funding, data shows that less than 4% of that money has actually been used to help eligible households. This is putting millions of families at risk of eviction and severely hurting landlords across the country. Under the previous administration, Treasury issued binding emergency rental assistance program rules and FAQ guidance to accompany those funds in January on January 19th. The Biden administration then opted to rescind that guidance and published new ERA rules in February. It then revised rules again in March, then added new rules in May, and then revised and added new rules again in June. Secretary Fudge, how has this constant revision of rules and added red tape slowed ERA funds from helping eligible families and households who have need?
Well, it really hasn't slowed it, because you remember that the money actually came out of Treasury and it went immediately. The rulemaking, I agree, has probably been somewhat cumbersome. I don't disagree with you on that. But it has not been the problem with getting the resources out.
I'm concerned that housing policies coming out of the White House and HUD are simply throwing money at old, outdated programs that will not build or incentivize the creation of new housing units. Several modern, innovative programs do exist, and they are working well in states like mine. My friend from Arkansas, Mr. Hill, emphasized how the RAD program is a proven solution that allows residents greater choices and flexibility. Secretary Fudge, could you expand on some of the benefits that the RAD program has created for public housing authorities and residents of public housing?
Well, obviously the advantage is that they leverage the resources that the public housing authorities already have, and it gives them the opportunity to do more things, especially as it relates to capital improvements, than they could have just through the resources that this Congress in its wisdom does give them.
Since the Biden administration's prior proposals include putting tens of billions into retrofitting public housing, is that a step away from successful programs like RAD?
Oh, absolutely not.
What do you think the administration should do to seize the opportunity that RAD creates?
I mean, the RAD is expanding all over the country. I mean, no one is trying to do away with RAD. I don't know if that's what you are thinking. But what we want is to take care of the people in public housing. We want to be sure that they live in safe, decent housing. We want to be sure that we can fix leaking roofs and take mold off of walls. We want to be sure that we don't have rodent infestation. We want to be sure that they are living in a decent environment. And if RAD helps do that, that's great. We are all for whatever it is that we can do within, obviously, our responsibilities and our authority to make sure that people live in decent housing.
Thank you. In Tennessee's 6th Congressional District, which I represent, 12.9% of total occupied housing units are manufactured homes. Manufactured housing is the most affordable home ownership option available nationwide for minorities, underserved, and low-income borrowers. According to U.S. Census data, 90% of new homes under $75,000 are manufactured housing. Yet increasingly, we are seeing scenarios where localities use zoning ordinances to exclude affordable manufactured homes in their communities. HUD has the authority to prevent localities from excluding manufactured homes, yet they have not utilized it. How can HUD encourage communities to expand their affordable housing options like manufactured homes?
I would disagree that HUD has the ability to change local zoning. We do not.
So you don't see a way that HUD can help to encourage local communities?
We're working on it, but we do not have the authority to change local zoning.
Okay. Thank you, Madam Chair, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman's time has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentlewoman from Georgia, Ms. Williams, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Secretary Fudge, for joining us today. Today's hearing builds an important foundation for our shared work to ensure that low-income families and those most marginalized are well served by HUD's programs. As we move forward with this work, we need to focus on breaking down barriers that folks face getting a decent home, but we also need to be thinking about how we can maximize opportunity and minimize disparities through the housing system. I have legislation, the Voters on the Move Registration Act, included as a part of this hearing today, and it helps ensure that as we get individuals housed, we also break down any barriers they face in getting registered to vote at their new residence. My bill would task the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau to work with the Election Assistance Commission to issue information on how individuals who are moving can register to vote and what their voting rights are under the law. This will ensure public housing agencies and owners of federally assisted housing can provide this information and make moving a little bit easier for their tenants. This bill is based on a simple idea. It shouldn't matter how often you have to move or what zip code you're moving to. People should have the tools they need to exercise their voice in our representative government. Secretary Fudge, how can empowering tenants in HUD's programs with more information as they move, whether it's about their rights or services that they can access, help to reduce socioeconomic disparities for the populations that those programs serve?
Well, I would say that people underestimate people who live in public housing. Most people who live in public housing do want to know what their rights are. They do want to understand how they can become more involved in their communities. That's why we have more and more tenants associations. That's why they're asking for more information. They want computers in their community rooms. They want to be able to be a contributing member of society like everybody else. And so I think that it's great.
Thank you so much, and I have no additional questions. I'm looking forward to working with you on implementing this program and getting everyone the access and information that they need to continue to voice their concerns and be a part of our representative government. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlelady yields back. The gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Lutkemeyer, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Congressional Democrats are falling woefully short on their responsibility to conduct oversight of the Biden administration, and the American people need to know about it. Currently at the CFPB, we have an acting director who has not been confirmed by the Senate, making major policy decisions. He has taken 9 enforcement actions, rescinded administration guidelines on the CFPB's policy for combating abusive industry practices, delayed the implementation of the debt collection rule, and is moving full speed ahead on a rule to implement Section 1071 of Dodd-Frank. Furthermore, there have been reports the CFPB has used incentive packages and started investigations into senior career staff in order to remove them from the Bureau due to their political affiliation. This could potentially violate the Civil Service Reform Act. And while the acting director has been busy leaving his mark at the CFPB, the chairwoman can't find time to have him testify before this committee. In fact, at the end of this month, it will have been a full year since someone from the CFPB testified in this committee. Conversely, when Director Kraniger was the head of the CFPB, Chairman Waters took over the Chairman Waters took over the chairmanship of this committee. It took only 2 months for her to call up the former director. As far as this committee hearing goes today, the single most pressing housing issue in this country that this country is facing is the eviction moratorium, which is set to expire July the 31st. While multiple courts have ruled the eviction moratorium is unconstitutional, Congress responded to the crisis facing renters by passing $46 billion in renter assistance. The idea is simple. If Congress provides you the money, you pay your rent, and you pay back rent, and you won't be evicted. However, to date, the Treasury has reported only $1.5 billion of the $46 billion given to the program has actually reached renters. Why the ineptitude by Treasury? Could it be that the Treasury Secretary has completely abandoned any sense of ownership or oversight of these programs and refuses to appear in front of Congress to discuss them? Secretary Yellen is statutorily required to appear in front of this Financial Services Committee on a quarterly basis to discuss the pandemic and the economic recovery. It was agreed to on a bipartisan basis in the CARES Act and was even maintained in the partisan Democrat bill passed this March. But where was Secretary last quarter? The answer is absolutely nowhere near this committee. Unless she plans on appearing in September, it will mark 2 consecutive quarters where she has broken the law by failing to appear before us. I also serve as ranking member of the House Small Business Committee. Secretary Yellen was statutorily required to testify in front of the Small Business Committee before April 26th of this year on the PPP program. But to no one's surprise, she has yet to appear there. I'm aware of her schedule, and she has attended at least 2 political events and made an overseas trip. Now, I'm not complaining about her doing those things, but I'm making the point that she has time for that. She has time to do her statutory duty, which is appear here. What's worse, I think that our colleagues across the aisle don't seem to want to hold Biden appointees accountable, and I think it's this willful neglect of the law that's at the expense of the American people's view of it that is going to be just going to take its toll. With that, let me begin my questioning. Secretary Fudge, welcome, by the way. One of the largest drivers of housing affordability is the lack of affordable housing. Specifically during the pandemic, we have seen the impacts of a low housing stock on home prices. According to the National Association of Home Builders and the National Multi-Housing Council, regulations imposed by all levels of government accounts for an average of 32% of multifamily development costs. In fact, in a quarter of the cases, that number is at least 42%. What is HUD doing to alleviate or minimize the costs, these kind of costs to multifamily developments?
Well, I have had an opportunity to meet with the home buyers, and certainly HUD is not responsible for the costs of lumber or plastic or anything else, but what we are trying to do is assist commerce and other agencies who look at the supply chain. You know, my colleagues for many, many years when I was here talked about the free market. It is a free market. That is what we are dealing with. And so there's nothing that HUD specifically can do to bring down the cost of housing, other than through the programs you all have approved to do gap funding, whether it be the Housing Trust Fund, whether it be CDBG, whether it be home.
Okay, my time is running short here. I apologize. But my question is, there's 32% of the multifamily housing that are development costs and 42% in other cases. And so the number is huge on rules and regulations. Is there something that you think you can do to help minimize that?
No, that's what I was saying. We're trying to provide gap financing. So let's just say that a cost of a home now is $32,000 and more than it was a year ago. Through things like home, things that Congress has approved, home, through low-income housing tax credits, through all of the other things that the tools you have given us, we can at least bring down the cost for the end user. We can't bring down the cost of the unit itself.
Well, that's the problem. Is the development costs on the front end are where the costs are. We've got to minimize those somehow. And we sure
will now recognize the gentleman, Mr. Auchincloss, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and welcome, Madam Secretary. I did not have the pleasure of working with you in Congress, but I'm looking forward to working with you in your new position, especially as housing is probably the single biggest issue in the district I represent, the Massachusetts 4th. I represent a socioeconomically diverse district where in the inner suburbs of Boston, housing prices can be well above $1 million, and in the southeastern part of Massachusetts, less than a fifth of that. But north and south of the district, housing is always top of people's minds, and we've seen double-digit increases in the price of housing over the last several years. And I'm pleased that Massachusetts has started to step up in this area. Earlier this year, late last year, the state legislature passed the Housing Choice Bill, which reduced from a supermajority to a simple majority the vote count required for zoning boards to approve special permits, make it easier to build housing at the local level. It's not exhaustive, but it's a good first step to alleviate the pressure in the housing market, especially in the parts of the district where demand greatly outpaces supply and zoning has become really exclusionary. Understanding that HUD cannot directly change zoning laws, are there other steps that you would like to see Massachusetts and the other states of the union, in your experience working on housing for so long, do to encourage more housing through statutory changes?
Yes, we know we can't change it, but we are having discussions. We are trying to find ways to even just bring to their attention some of the ordinances that they may have that are detrimental. You know, as a mayor, I didn't go back and look at things we did 30, 40, 50 years ago, but when someone brings to my attention, you know what, if you just change this one small thing, that may bring down the cost of housing. So we are having those discussions, but the other things we are doing is trying to say to them, we have, through Congress, we have increased funding in our Housing Trust Fund, which is designed to assist with building or providing housing for low and moderate income people. Use those resources to help you make that housing affordable. We have CDBG and home money. Home money is very, very flexible, that we can provide some resources to assist the end user. Let's say that it costs them, and I'm using a small number, obviously, $50,000 to build a home, but the average person, the low and moderate income person, can only afford $40,000. We can make up that $10,000 difference. So there are tools that Congress has given us that we can use. It's just that we need the local communities to help us to do it.
And Madam Secretary, can we work with your office on that as we explore housing issues?
Absolutely.
Thank you. Now, in the southern part of my district, the city of Fall River is registering abandoned housing and working with the state to bring that housing up to code. And there are many communities that are working hard to return these kind of abandoned properties to clean and habitable places to live. Are there programs that HUD is pursuing that makes it easier for cities like Fall River to upgrade abandoned properties and turn it into habitable places to live?
Yeah, we have all kinds of low-income housing, if that's what you're asking me. And if you just call our office, we can give you all the information that you need so that you can maybe assist them, because a lot of times small communities don't even know it's available. We'd be happy to do it.
I appreciate that, Madam Secretary. And then the final question, I want to build off what the gentlewoman from Michigan was asking before her time expired. The chairwoman has proposed a transformative series of bills, housing as infrastructure, And I want to give you the opportunity, Madam Secretary, to just tell this committee what you think this funding and this policy put forward by the Chairwoman could do for housing stability and housing access in the country.
Well, if you would allow me, I won't discuss the various parts of the legislation, but I will say to you that housing is probably the #1 crisis in this country today. And whatever it takes for us to start to address it, I don't know if it's that piece or a lot of pieces of legislation, but if we do not address this crisis now, it is just going to continue to get worse. Housing was a crisis before COVID. All COVID did was lay bare how big a crisis it was. And if we do not take this opportunity to invest in housing, as we have not done in generations, we will never be able to catch up.
Thank you, Madam Secretary, and I'll yield back the balance of my time, Mr. Chair.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Timmons, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Fudge, congratulations on your new position, and thank you for being with us today. I want to begin by associating myself with my colleague, Representative Beatty, when she said that you are not accountable for the actions of Secretary Yellen. She's right. You are not directly responsible for the administration of the emergency rental assistance dollars, but I think we can all agree that this is a critically important issue, and that since Secretary Yellen is not here and will not appear before this committee before the eviction moratorium expires at the end of the month, it is our responsibility to do whatever we can to push this issue to the forefront. I also think that we can all agree that there remains a great need to get these dollars, not just in the hands of state and local governments, but actually to the intended target, renters and their landlords. We can all surely agree that's the goal. Mr. Hill said earlier that the legislation was drafted in a way that does really put the onus on state and local governments to run this program, and we can see that they're just not doing a very good job. You also said earlier that our job is to provide oversight, and we're trying to do that, but it's just not working. The dollars are not getting where they need to go. And obviously, we know time is running out. You also said earlier that you don't even know how much money has actually made its way to the tenants that are in need, and you've only been on the job for a few months, so that's not your fault, but we need to find out, and we need to get this done quickly. So my question is this: can you help us find out just how much of the $40+ billion we appropriated has reached its intended target, and can you please help get these resources where they need to go?
Yes, I will do everything I can to make sure you have it. I will get in touch with Treasury, see if I can get those numbers for you, as well as, yes, we are continuing to talk. We do have oversight, but we just can't demand.
Is there anything, I've only been here for 2.5 years. You spent more time in this body than I have. So what else can we do that we're not?
Well, one of the things that I did when I was a member of Congress, I would go and talk to my state and local people and tell them what needed to be done. I was proactive in making sure that they knew what was happening. So I didn't sit back. I really went and took the initiative to say to them, if you don't do this, you are failing your own constituents. You know, as members of Congress, you all have constituents. I have them too. They're people that live in housing that we support.
Sure.
And so we do the best we can to make sure we can be helpful.
Maybe any resources that you could provide to give us best practices on how to actually achieve these objectives, I would really appreciate that. And I just want to say thank you for your help in this, achieving this very important objective. I want to switch gears to vaccine hesitancy. During your exchange with Mr. Cleaver, you ran through the Biden administration's efforts to vaccinate Americans living in public housing against COVID-19, and I appreciate those efforts. I've been telling everyone in my district that wants to get a vaccine, they need to get one because we got to get back to work and we got to get on with our lives. So I want to go to some of the words that we heard during the election. I guess Vice President Harris, then candidate Harris, said, if passed as prologue, the scientists and health officials will not be able to weigh in on the efficacy of the vaccine. They'll be muzzled, they'll be suppressed, they will be sidelined. So when we look at the vaccine hesitancy amongst demographic groups, we see that rates, particularly in the African American community, they're not where they should be. And my question is, what can we do to help fix this problem? What can we do to help repair the trust in government?
Well, there are a couple of things. One, obviously, is there is a justified distrust by African Americans of the government. Because even today, More women die in childbirth that are Black than any other color. More doctors ignore problems that Black people have than ever before. And so there is a justified distrust, especially in medicine. But I think that what we have to do is go to the people, which is something that we historically do not do. It does not bother me to go into a public housing facility and talk with them about getting the shot. Because I think that when people they trust talk with them, whether it be their pastor, the college coach, the high school coach, people like me, people like you, I think that they have a different outcome. And so I'm hopeful that all of us will realize how important it is to have one-on-one conversations. I think that can turn the tide.
Well, I hope that everyone that wants a vaccine can get one as quickly as possible, because we do need to get back to work. That's the only thing that's going to help get our economy back on track. So thank you, Madam Secretary. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentlewoman from North Carolina, Ms. Adams, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Madam Secretary, what a wonderful sound that is. First of all, I want to say what a pleasure it is to have you here today. I was honored to serve with you in this body, and I'm grateful for your excellent leadership at HUD. And I thank you for showing up in my district when we ask you to speak. So, Secretary Fudge, you touched on Section 8 vouchers and source of income discrimination. Currently in my district, there's an 11-year wait list to receive a voucher. And what's worse, 21% of the families in my district who received the voucher were unable to find housing by the time the voucher expired, which is like 180 days. So can you describe why it's so important that we move swiftly to end source of income discrimination nationwide? And what is the possibility of expanding that 180 days and issuing, and also issuing more vouchers?
Well, three things, and thank you so much. It's nice to see you as well. Source of income has been, discrimination has been around a long time, even just Social Security. You know, we have people who, and it's always been a little crazy to me because they know they're gonna get a check every month. So I've never been able to understand why there were these issues. But what we are finding more and more because of the lack of supply, that people are not accepting these because they know they can make so much more. So we need to expand the base of rental properties. You can have thousands and thousands of vouchers, but if there's no place for them to use them because people are upset because they get Social Security or they get some kind of disability check or some other kind, we do need to find a way to legally prevent source of income discrimination. We've been talking about it within fair housing. We're trying to find a way to do it, and as we get further in our discussions, I'd be happy to talk to you about where we are.
Okay, great. So your 2022 budget calls for $100 million to support public housing conversions to a Section 8 platform under the rental assistance. So can you explain a little bit how HUD, under your stewardship, will administer the rental assistance in such a way that long-term affordability and public oversight is maintained, and the residents are not at risk of losing stable housing that they can afford?
There is no circumstance by which RAD or any other program would be totally privately controlled. Generally, it's a 40-60 split for the most part. There's a RAD project right here in Maryland that I would love for you to take a look at some point. We'll get you the information. But trust me very, very clearly on this. I will never, ever allow the privatization of public housing.
Thank you, ma'am. I'd also like to take this time to say that my bill, the Promoting Resident Opportunities and Self-Sufficiency Act, would help ensure that residents who live in housing units that are converted by RAD would still receive critical congregant housing services. So, as you know, Black borrowers rely on and obtain FHA and VA mortgage loans at much higher rates than conventional loans guaranteed by Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. In 2019, about 37% of Black home buyers bought homes using the FHA mortgage insurance program. Despite the fact that FHA is overwhelmingly serving Black borrowers, the overall home ownership gap is still wider than it was in 1968. So do you think that the conventional market, including Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, could do a better job of serving more borrowers of color to help narrow that overall gap? And do you have any ideas on how that might be done and what role HUD could play?
We absolutely can do a better job, and we will do a better job. We are right now looking at how FHA determines creditworthiness. We are looking at how FHA determines which mortgages they want to do. We're looking at small dollar loans. We are taking every single thing out of the box.
Great.
Because HUD has been as much a problem through FHA and GSEs as anyone.
Great. Well, thank you, Madam Secretary, for being here. And Chairwoman Waters, I want to thank you for having the Secretary, inviting her here to come and address this body. And certainly, if there's anything my office can do to assist you, please reach out to us. Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Thank you very much. The gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Budd, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
I thank the Chair and Secretary. Congratulations on your new role. So, Secretary, this is a bit of a follow-up from a prior colleague. So it seems like funds that are spent on infrastructure development, it would go a lot further if it was paired with regulatory reforms that reduce the cost of construction. Fair enough, right? So according to the National Association of Home Builders and also National Multifamily Housing Council, up to 30% of the cost of new construction, so the cost of development of housing, it's due to regulations at the federal, state, and the local level. Now, when you weighed in earlier, it's my understanding that you said HUD can't really help with state and local regulations. HUD cannot, right?
I said zoning.
It was zoning, okay. It's just a small part of the regulations. So here's what's going on in my district, and I imagine many of our districts. People are having a hard time affording housing. There's no ability to help. Yeah, I mean, you're sending money to bike paths and pools, tree planting. Now, in some world, that's actually a fine idea, but not now. So I'm concerned that you have a tremendous ability to make housing more affordable. You could make funding conditional on lower regulations at the state and local level. But is there anything you can do to reduce a single regulatory hurdle that would lower the cost of housing for regular Americans?
Let me just first say, I don't send money to pools. Communities do that. Secondly, I would say to you that, as I have said earlier, we do not control states. We control what we control based on the law. We are always going to follow the law. But tomorrow, somebody will be asking me why we are trying to control what their states do. What we do is what you have authorized us to do.
Thank you. I'm going to reclaim my time. And what I see is we have a tremendous influence here in how the federal works with state. Of course, we want to preserve the rights of states and the strength of states and regulations, but we want to make sure that properly steer people to properly use federal taxpayer dollars. I think we all could agree with that. Thank you. And we certainly want to lower the cost of housing for average, everyday, sometimes they feel like they're the forgotten Americans out there. Well, I want to continue on. It's no secret that America has a housing supply shortage. President Biden's plan is to build, preserve, and retrofit more than 2 million homes and commercial buildings to address the affordable housing crisis. However, that initiative attempts to merge the building of new units with existing units, sort of an upfit. So preserving or retrofitting a unit might be good for its current occupant, but that's no substitute for creating a new housing unit that meets an unmet need. So, and this is an easy math question here, how many new units of housing are created when an existing home or housing is retrofitted?
Well, obviously, none.
Yep.
But that's not what the president did. The president asked for 2 million new units and retrofitting 500,000.
So we're spending a lot of that $213 billion on retrofitting, thus not creating new units or creating less than otherwise could have been. So of the $213 billion the Biden infrastructure proposal wants to spend, what sort of percentage should be devoted exclusively to the building of new housing units? You can give that to me in a dollar sign or percentage, either one, of the $213 billion.
It's not broken down at all. It's just a top line number, which I think all of us know.
So do you think that some should be devoted exclusively to the building of new housing units?
Absolutely.
Thank you. Slightly different question before I yield back. And I'm just getting details on this and still awaiting more information. I understand that 3 HUD nominees are on record for supporting defund the police efforts. Is that something that you would support, nominees who support defunding the police?
First off, I don't know that that's accurate because I don't know.
And we're still getting details on that. But if that was to come up and they were on record for supporting defund the police, is that something that you would support their nomination?
That is not my decision, sir. That is the decision of the U.S. Senate.
So you would not weigh in on that if that was something they were supportive?
I would not weigh in.
Okay, thank you. I yield back to the chair.
The gentlewoman from New York, Ms. Ocasio-Cortez, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Chairwoman Waters, for convening this important hearing, and thank you, Secretary Fudge, for coming before us today and sharing your expertise and knowledge. And you know, I think hearing a lot of these question lines and from their side of the aisle, it kind of feels like Groundhog Day, right? It's the same 2 or 3 things that we're hearing over and over and over again. And I think that there's some confusion, or perhaps some of this information that you're trying to communicate isn't quite getting across. So I want us to talk about the emergency rental assistance program. We know, for folks who are just, you know, tuning in at home, this was developed in response to the crisis that we had due to the pandemic. We had massive spikes in unemployment due to shutdowns, and people were at risk of losing their homes and being evicted. So Congress authorized a total in 2 sums of about $46 billion in emergency rental assistance to get to tenants and landlords to help cover the rent during this time. Now, the issue that we have is that the CDC's eviction moratorium is set to expire in 11 days. And out of this $46 billion that we have authorized and that has been provided in emergency rental assistance, very little of that has gone out. Now, again, this is, as you've communicated throughout this hearing, this is not under the domain and not due to any bottlenecks at HUD, but you would say that this is due to state and local municipal governments, correct?
Correct.
The checks have gone out, that money has been dispersed, and the reason, the holdup, is because governors, mayors, municipal governments are not getting it out to people, correct?
Correct.
So all of this hubbub about wanting to talk to the Treasury Secretary and you being right before us with your expertise, I think they're trying to address the wrong folks in this bottleneck. Would that be a fair assessment to make?
Yes.
Thank you. And so if my colleagues are concerned about these bottlenecks, they need to get their governors on the phone, they need to get their mayors on the phone. Would you say that's correct?
Yes.
And I would beseech my colleagues, if they represent a state where their governor is of their same party, to be unafraid to hold your own party governors accountable. I say this as a person who does that within my own party. Now, what I will say that I'd like to engage with you on today is that I am concerned about some of the communications happening with the Biden administration regarding the eviction moratorium date. The eviction moratorium is set to expire within 11 days, and whether it's in federal control or not, the money to help people has not gone out. So my question to you is, in your view, should this eviction moratorium be extended?
If I may say this, Congresswoman, I think you're going to see significantly higher numbers of usage by the end of this month. I would say that I can't speak for the CDC, and the only reason that it's being extended is because the CDC has said that there is a health crisis. So I don't know that really it's something that can be done if, in fact, we believe that we are coming out of COVID. So I would just suggest that, as you said, all hands on deck.
Okay, thank you. And while I know that this isn't quite under HUD, we do know, and this has come up during the course of this hearing, that housing is a profound social indicator of health, correct?
Yes.
And would it be fair to say that if for whatever reasons due to the emergency rental assistance not coming out in time, if it wasn't, if we evicted if this resulted in a large population of people being evicted due to this mismatch in timing and fund distribution, could that precipitate almost a secondary public health crisis and concern due to displacement and homelessness?
Well, certainly it could.
And do you believe that the CDC should potentially consider housing status as an indicator in health and public health?
No, I think that every single person in America should be trying to figure out how we keep people in their homes. So, I mean, those are discussions that I know will come up with CDC, but I'm certainly hopeful that we will not have to face that.
Of course, thank you very much.
Thank you. The gentleman from Wisconsin's Mr. Stile is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Secretary Fudge, thank you for being here with us today. I think it's important to note that one thing was left off in our most recent conversation, and that is that the CDC's moratorium on the evictions has been found to be unconstitutional by 2 courts. So we're heading down the railroad tracks here, and the bridge is out. And so my concern is that by saying that HUD has done its job, but the states have been slow, that's not a lot of solace to an individual in Racine, Wisconsin, in my district, or a city across the United States who finds themselves out of their home because the funds haven't made it all the way from HUD through the state to that individual or to their respective landlord. And one of my real concerns is that the Biden administration has rewritten the guidance and the rules on this 4 times. They rewrote it in February, they rewrote it in March, they rewrote it in May, and they rewrote it in June. And so I have real concern that we're heading down this railroad track. The bridge is out. The moratorium has been ruled unconstitutional. And although HUD has, as you, I think, correctly noted, made those funds available to the states haven't acted. I would note that the rewriting of that guidance by the Biden administration gives me great pause for concern. But let me shift gears and dive into an issue that I have great concern with, and it's the impact of rising costs on American families. It's hard to ignore the fact that prices have continued to increase, and they're increasing at a rate faster than we've really seen since 2008. And I think we know why this is happening. Washington has dramatically increased spending, and the Fed continues to push an aggressive monetary policy. And as a result of these misguided government schemes like paying people not to work, supply chain and labor force problems are taking even longer to resolve. And as I discussed with Chairman Powell last week, this might lead to a reset of our inflation expectations, creating a self-fulfilling prophecy driving higher inflation. And this means more uncertainty and higher prices for American families. And these price increases flow directly into housing costs. Rising material costs have added $36,000 to the price of a new home. Nationwide home prices are up 14% in the past year. And it's not just economists that are talking about it. The American public is feeling it. I talk to people on a regular basis who stop me in the grocery store and talk to me about the impact of the rising groceries, but also the rising costs for them to live their life. And so as I read your testimony today, the word climate appears in your testimony 5 times, equity appears twice, but I find it a little bit interesting as I read that you failed to mention the word inflation once out of 1,300 words in your written opening statement. And I worry about this administration's misplaced priorities, which I think are out of step with the American families. Can I, to be direct for a question here, have you or HUD done analysis on the impact of rising costs on working class Americans and their ability to purchase a home?
Let me first say that every reputable economist in this country has said that inflation will be temporary only, and that it is not something to be concerned about. And secondly, let me say that 2 courts have found the CDC's moratorium unconstitutional, but 2 have found it constitutional. And the Supreme Court of the United States let it proceed. Now, as it relates to the cost, yes, we are looking at the cost. I mean, that's what we do.
And what is that showing? As costs have gone up for a new home has increased $36,000. What have your studies said by that?
Well, the home builders told me it was going up because of the cost of goods and services. I believe them.
So I'm gonna, let me then shift gears into how the policies of demand side subsidies, I think, will also increase prices. So I think one is the Biden administration's policies and the aggressive spending we're seeing in DC is increasing the prices. It's showing up, the economists that you're speaking with, that is making homes more difficult and more out of reach for the average American. But also, as we look at the policies being put in place, increasing demand side prices, you mentioned in your testimony your support for more vouchers and other subsidies to challenge renters. I know Chair Waters has also proposed expanding the voucher program to make it an entitlement. And I'm concerned that broad demand side subsidies fail to address one of the underlying problems in our housing market, which could be the fact of a lack of supply. And it seems like we should be working to encourage developers to build more homes. What is, in your opinion, getting in the way of increasing the supply?
There are so many, it would take me an hour to have that conversation with you. And I think, sir, just to be honest, that your assessment is really very unfair. You know that there are many issues as to the cost of housing as well.
Gentleman, time has expired. The gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Caston, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Secretary Fudge, so nice to see you here. Congratulations. We are fortunate to have you at the helm of HUD. This will not surprise you. I'd like to talk about climate change, and specifically that the 2022 budget proposes $800 million for targeted investments in energy efficiency and resiliency in the housing sector. And this is through the Biden whole-of-government approach to climate. And I am so excited to finally have a White House that is taking a whole-of-government approach. It's maddening to me that we subsidize energy extraction in this country, and we also subsidize energy conservation. It's amazing that we get anything done when we're driving in the same direction. My first question, and this could be very long, but I want to get to 2 more questions, so if you could just, I'm just curious if you are satisfied that within the silos within HUD, you are coordinating and rowing in the same direction and across the other various government agencies, because we've never really had a whole-of-government approach to climate change before. And are you satisfied that you have the tools you do to coordinate and make sure that we're rowing in the same direction? Is there anything we can do to help, if not?
We just hired one person whose sole responsibility is climate and working across agencies. So I'm feeling good about the fact that we recognize it, we've elevated it, and are giving that person the staff that they need to make sure that we can do this right.
Terrific. Well, let us know if we can help. Second question, when I was with the president when he was out in Illinois 2 weeks ago, we had a brief conversation about the fact that there is that which is necessary scientifically for us to leave a better planet to our children than the one we inherited, and there's that which is politically possible. And over the course of my lifetime and my brief tenure in this job, I think we've twisted our arm an awful lot, congratulating ourselves for doing what's politically possible. And if you're comfortable answering the question, I'm curious whether $800 million of investment in our housing stock for resiliency and efficiency meets all of your needs, or is that just the limit of what's possible?
Well, certainly doesn't meet all the needs. I mean, I don't think that any of us believe that it does, but what we do know is that it is a great place to begin. It's more than we've ever put in it. It's more than we've ever done as a nation, especially when we have members of this Congress who don't even believe in climate change. So we are doing the very best we can to really make a mark and to set the example for what we can do if we put the kind of resources in it that it really needs.
Okay. The last question, and this ties into a number of issues. My colleagues have heard me talk before that the CFTC, in the Trump White House, the CFTC issued this report, Managing Climate Change in the Financial Sector, which pointed out, among other things, that there is a huge concentration of exposure in the collateralized mortgage-backed securities market. In Houston, I think something like 25% of all of that portfolio is in Houston, New York, and Miami that are exposed to massive losses, and how should we be thinking about that? Now, that's obviously a bit outside of your agency, but as the frequency of these natural disasters increases, the CDBG disaster recovery program has become an increasingly important portion. In 2017, natural disasters caused $306 billion with a B dollars in damages in the United States. But as I don't need to tell you, that program has never been authorized. So you have to come back for a Federal Register notice for each one-off appropriation. How would permanent authorization of that program better help you do your job and better help communities recover after a disaster?
It would help significantly. It would allow us to move quicker. It would allow us to assess faster, because right now we do have to come back for authorization. It would be tremendous.
Thank you, and I have no further questions. Appreciate your time. Yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Gooden, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and welcome, Madam Secretary. An overwhelming amount of HUD funding to address homelessness goes to continuum of care boards, and those boards are responsible, as you know, for providing a holistic approach to end homelessness, including housing, soup kitchens, mental health, job placement, etc. It's my belief, based on conversations I've had with some in my local area, that many of them, not all, but many, operate as homeless cartels, if you will, with little oversight. The White House and HUD requested roughly $3.12 billion for continuum of care programs next fiscal year. And as an example of what I just stated, recently a grand jury in Fresno, California, criticized the COC model because it lacks transparency and is ripe with conflicts of interest. Additionally, a report from the California State Auditor confirmed the lack of oversight and effectiveness of continuum of care boards. The grand jury also mentioned the same people who control these board funding allocations are the same people in charge of the organizations receiving the funding. Do you feel, Madam Secretary, that there are adequate measures in place to provide effective oversight of these boards and prevent waste, fraud, and abuse?
I do, but I also do believe as well that we could do better.
Does HUD have any plans to improve these? Is there a plan of action in place? I would also ask, would you agree that allocating funding by some of these board members who may also sit on the boards of a nonprofit could be a conflict of interest?
If there are conflicts of interest, of course it would not be appropriate.
Wonderful. Would you commit to perhaps working with your staff, obviously, on this?
Absolutely. I'd be happy to do it.
That would be, I think, great, and I appreciate that. One thing I constantly hear from local leaders in the rural parts of my district is they often feel left out or forgotten when working with federal agents to address housing issues. And by some estimates, writing a single federal grant application takes a nonprofit an average of between 80 and 200 hours. And many jurisdictions don't have the staff or resources to even apply, let alone compete. Would you care to comment, or would you comment specifically on plans that your organization may have to reduce that burden and make it easier for small rural localities like those in my district to receive grants?
You know, that is a major problem. That is also one of the reasons we don't have the emergency rental money out as fast either, because smaller communities don't even know how to get it. They don't have the capacity, once they receive it, to figure out how to quickly move it through the system. So we are working with rural and small communities, particularly through technical assistance. I even met yesterday with the League of Cities. We are doing all we can to be sure that we get to those communities, because they get left out. I agree with you, 100%.
Thank you. And before I close, I'd like to congratulate you and welcome you. My friend Congresswoman Johanna Hayes was sitting behind you, supporting you, so I think you're missed by many of your colleagues. Welcome. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
I close.
Thank you. The gentleman from New York, Mr. Torres, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It's always a pleasure to see you, Madam Secretary. I hope your nephew, who cares as deeply about NYCHA as I do, is doing well. As you know, the state of public housing has been plagued by decades of disinvestment at the hands of the federal government. I would characterize the state of public housing in New York City as demolition by neglect. And the fate of the New York City Housing Authority, the fate of America's largest public housing stock in America's largest city, will depend on what we do collectively in the upcoming reconciliation bill. NYCHA needs enough funding not only to address a capital need of $40 billion and counting, but also to transition to clean energy building systems. A central figure in the future of NYCHA is the HUD Regional Administrator, a position that remains vacant What is the timeline for appointing a new HUD regional administrator, specifically for Region 2?
I know that it's in the process. That's done by the White House Personnel Office, so I don't know the time frame.
Fair enough. On January 1st, 2022, a new mayor of New York City will assume office. The mayor historically has been in charge of the New York City Housing Authority by virtue of appointing both the CEO and the COO, the chair and the general manager. But as you might know, the relationship between the mayor and the Housing Authority was fundamentally altered by the administrative agreement among HUD, the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District, and the City of New York. Given the certainty of a new mayor in January of 2022, does HUD have any plans to restore mayoral control of the New York City Housing Authority?
Well, you know what, I would really need to look into it. I do know that there's federal oversight. I do know as well in my conversations with the Tenants Association there that they have some concerns as well that we need to take into consideration. But I don't have a problem with it personally, but I need to know if we can do it legally.
Fair enough. The president has proposed over $200 billion for affordable housing. When the subject of affordable housing is brought up, the question that often comes to mind is affordable for whom? And a concern that I've expressed is that if we expand housing supply without expanding housing subsidy, then we run the risk of creating housing that's unaffordable to the lowest income Americans. In my view, the best path to affordability for all Americans is the Ending Homelessness Act, which would universalize Section 8 vouchers. Of the $200 million that the president has proposed for affordable housing, how much do you envision going towards Section 8?
None of that. I mean, but there are set-asides. He's requesting 200,000 vouchers in addition to the $200 billion for new housing units.
So that's in addition.
Correct.
The Fair Housing Act, we often speak about systemic racism, and I would argue nowhere is systemic racism more manifest than in the area of housing, segregated schools. Do you think that exclusionary zoning laws are arguably a violation of the Fair Housing Act?
I'm not sure, but I would suggest this. It is a violation of everything we stand for.
Are you concerned that the administration recommends grants, incentives for states to adopt land use reforms? Are you concerned that incentives can only take us so far and that there might need to be enforcement of the Fair Housing Act?
I would say as a former mayor, I know how touchy that subject is with local communities because they don't believe that the federal government should come and tell them how they should zone. But I do believe, I really do believe, Mr. Torres, that it is a problem, that we have to address it. And I'm going to look at it from a federal, from the law and see if there's something that we could do with fair housing. I think that it's a good way to approach it. Let me take a look.
No, I know that there's resistance, but keep in mind, historically, there's been resistance to federal intervention when it comes to voting rights. States and localities would prefer to enact voting laws without any accountability to the federal government. But the reason for a federal role is to crack down on the complicity of states and localities in systemic racism. So I hope that's something you explore in greater detail.
Well, we're looking at systemic racism all throughout HUD. I mean, historically, systemic racism is in every single agency of the federal government, and we're no different. So we are trying to address it.
And obviously, public housing has been chronically underfunded. Have you thought about how to bring greater accountability to the operation and management of public housing? Is that a subject you've thought about?
Oh, I have given it great thought because of what I have found in my own travels, in talking with tenants, and I talk to tenants every place I go. So absolutely, I've given it a lot of thought.
And what's your thought on the New York City Housing Authority?
Well, one thing that I think that we have to do is to be honest, to be transparent, and to do our part. We can't change it all, but certainly there are some things we can change, and we should.
I see my time is about to expire, but always a pleasure.
My pleasure indeed.
Thank you very much. The gentleman from Florida, Mr. Lawson, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And Madam Secretary, welcome to the committee. It certainly is a pleasure to see you. And I want to thank you, first of all, for many of some of the housing problems that I've had in my district and the immediate action that you were able to take. My question will probably come at the end, but what I want to say is during my tenure as coaching at Florida State University, I spent a lot of time because that's where the athletes were located in New York, Chicago, in Ohio, in Atlanta, and many of those areas where they came out of major housing complex. And some of the things that I noticed then, there have been very little changes. Now, I am more concerned about, and I know that we face a housing shortage here, but I'm more concerned about the safety and the problems that I have been experiencing with some of the management companies. And those management companies I know getting federal dollars to keep up the upkeep and everything else. Could you elaborate on what condition, because I did with the last HUD secretary and nothing much happened. What is a way that we can improve the relationship with management companies so they help keep up the properties that so many, especially women, have to depend on with their kids to be in very safe conditions?
Let me just say, first off, it's nice to see you, Mr. Lawson. That is our responsibility. We have 64 offices across this country. We have a staff of about 7,000 people. Not nearly enough to do the work we do, but a big enough staff to do the work that we should do. We have to do our part. We have to make sure that our inspectors are doing their jobs, that our local people are doing their jobs, that we are doing our job. And we also have to hold these management companies and landlords accountable and let them know that we are not playing about this. We are going to make them keep up their end of the bargain, and we're going to keep up ours. It's all about leadership, and it is all about demanding that we do the work that the people are paying us to do, that we do the work that we have been charged to do by this Congress.
But that is very good to hear. And I know it might have been early because I was off early, I had a medical appointment. But I guess the key question in my last 2 minutes, and I know you have elaborated on it some, what can we do in Congress? I've heard a lot of the members talk about we need this, we need that. But what is, and I know you're more familiar with what has happened in Congress over the years, but what can we do now in Congress to alleviate a lot of problems that would help you all do your jobs better?
I didn't hear the last part, Mr. Lawson.
Just to help you all, what can we do in Congress?
Oh, what can you do to help us? One is, of course, give us the flexibility to do our jobs. I think it is important for people to understand they don't like the word flexibility, but if you allow us to do the work we know needs to be done, we talk about regulations and restrictions, but some of those are on us too. And so we need the flexibility to do the work that we know that we should do. That's what we need you to do, is just be supportive. The other thing, I think the biggest thing to do is to fund us properly. At one point, HUD made up 7% of the entire discretionary federal budget. Today, it's less than 1%, and the problem is just as great.
But I think one of the things that happened before my time ran out, that I noticed in the 4.5 years that I've been in Congress, these issues come up about HUD, and there's been a reluctance to provide the resources that we really need. But when members, myself and everybody go back to their district, they see the hardships. But at the same time, they don't realize that a lot of that has to do with what we do here while we're in Congress. And with that, Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lawson. I would like to now thank our distinguished witness, Secretary Fudge, for her testimony today. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit additional written questions for the Secretary to the Chair, which will be forwarded to the witness for her response. I ask our witness to please respond as promptly as you are able. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit extraneous materials to the Chair for inclusion in the record. And with that, I want to thank you so very much, Secretary Fudge, and the meeting is adjourned. Thank you.